If you're picturing candlelight, violins, and a trembling young man on one knee whispering, "Will you marry me?" Stop right there. You're thinking of the modern proposal. The Victorian version was less romantic declaration of love and more formal business transaction with lace trim. A proposal wasn't just about two people finding each other. It was about families merging assets like companies in a polite tea-scented merger. The average Victorian gentleman didn't pop the question. He presented it, ideally through a letter, a third party, or his mother. That's right. In many upper-class homes, even saying "I love you" directly to your intended could be considered indecent before marriage. Feelings were best handled like taxes, quietly and preferably by someone else. If you were a Victorian father with a daughter, your home was less household and more bridal showroom. Daughters were considered the family's best investments, valuable but depreciating quickly after the age of 25. A good proposal could restore family prestige. A bad one could doom the lineage to obscurity. Romantic love? That was a luxury reserved for novels and people who didn't have an estate to maintain. A man's proposal wasn't always about what he wanted. It was often about what he could afford. Love might move mountains, but it did nothing for mortgage payments. Before proposing, a gentleman had to ensure his income met a socially acceptable minimum. And by minimum, we mean could she buy unnecessary lace monthly without financial collapse? If not, he was politely discouraged. Hello, travellers. Histories do not always need to be boring. You can rest here and listen to hilarious histories to drift off to sleep. Before we continue, leave a comment to let me know when and where you are listening to this, and hit the subscribe button, but only if you enjoy what I do here. Let's begin. This created a culture where courtship was basically job interviews disguised as garden strolls. Men showcased their moral character and bank accounts. Women demonstrated charm, modesty, and the ability to pretend men's jokes were funny. Eye contact lingered, fans fluttered, and entire futures were decided between bites of cucumber sandwiches. When the big question finally came, it wasn't always spoken aloud. A letter of proposal might begin with something thrilling like, "Madam, I beg leave to express my profound esteem for your virtues and to request the honour of addressing you." Which sounds lovely until you realise that's 19th century code for "I've discussed this with your father and the paperwork looks good." And if you think the recipient was free to say no, think again. For upper and middle class women, rejecting a suitor wasn't just awkward, it was dangerous. Saying no could ruin reputations, anger families, and end friendships. Society assumed that any woman who turned down a respectable man must be defective in some mysterious moral way. Meanwhile, if the man withdrew his proposal, it was considered unfortunate, not scandalous. In short, double standards, the true Victorian tradition. Even the emotions of engagement were carefully policed. Too happy, and you seemed vulgar. Too indifferent, and you were heartless. The ideal fiancée was delicately joyful, thrilled, but in a way that wouldn't wrinkle her gloves. Engagements were less about emotional connection and more about proving one could follow etiquette under pressure. Then came the matter of approval. The bride's father didn't just say yes to the union. He signed off like a CEO authorizing a merger. Suitors were expected to provide credentials, financial stability, moral conduct, good breeding, and ideally no history of scandal or syphilis. A promising match could unite estates, strengthen political ties, or at least produce grandchildren with acceptable jawlines. But here's the cruel irony. For many Victorian women, this cold system was their only path to security. Once married, a woman's legal existence essentially merged with her husband's. She couldn't own property or control her money. So the proposal wasn't just a declaration, it was a lifeboat. Many accepted not out of love, but out of necessity, hoping that affection might bloom later between the ledgers and lace. Still, there were moments of tenderness, quiet ones hidden beneath the rules. A stolen glance across a drawing room, a pressed flower tucked into a book, a trembling hand offering a ring that had passed through generations. Beneath the layers of etiquette, some Victorians did fall in love. They just had to do it under the watchful gaze of chaperones, clergy, and everyone who owned a monocle. So the next time someone sighs over the romance of Victorian times, remember this: proposals weren't fairy tales. They were negotiations performed with excellent penmanship. Love might have been part of it, but only after the accountants had their say. Victorian romance, where love letters came with financial clauses, rejection required legal strategy, and passion was something you scheduled between family approvals. If a Victorian proposal was the opening act, the family negotiations were the 3-hour opera that followed, complete with drama, suspense, and relatives who refused to exit stage left. Engagements in the 19th century weren't just about lovebirds exchanging rings, they were about entire dynasties preparing for social warfare. Forget two hearts becoming one, this was two households, both alike in dignity, now forced to share a seating chart. Once the proposal was accepted, the real work began, and by work, we mean bargaining with a smile. Victorian families treated marriage like a joint business venture, where the product was respectability and the risk was lifelong scandal. Negotiations weren't limited to financial arrangements. They involved property, reputation, future heirs, and occasionally which cousin had to be kept away from the punch bowl. The bride's family, especially her mother, became instant project managers. There were dowries to finalise, family trees to cross-check, and reputations to polish like the good silver. The father, meanwhile, acted as the reluctant treasurer, trying to figure out how to appear generous without actually going bankrupt. A wealthy bride might bring a tidy fortune into the marriage. A less wealthy one might at least offer excellent breeding, which was Victorian code for broke but polite. The groom's family in turn assessed the bride as though she were an estate under inspection. Was she well educated, meaning she could play piano without being unbearable? Was she well mannered, meaning she wouldn't talk about digestion in public? Did her family have any skeletons in the wardrobe? Or worse, trade connections? Victorians were obsessed with good breeding, which was less about moral virtue and more about avoiding anyone whose fortune came from actually working. At dinner tables across Britain, these conversations unfolded in tones so polite they could curdle milk. "Your daughter has such charm," a mother might say, meaning, "We're still investigating her uncle's gambling problem." Meanwhile, "Your son has excellent prospects," roughly translated to, "He hasn't inherited debt or tuberculosis yet." And then came the dowry, the glittering elephant in the room. The dowry was not a quaint tradition, it was the financial heart of the transaction. It determined not just the scale of the wedding, but often whether the marriage would happen at all. Fathers haggled like seasoned diplomats. £2,000 in a carriage? 3,000, and we'll throw in the piano. This wasn't romance, it was real estate negotiations with lace napkins. Even worse, some families lied about their wealth to appear more respectable. Victorians adored appearances, and if that meant pretending one's country house wasn't held together by optimism and unpaid servants, so be it. Entire engagements were built on exaggerated fortunes, with everyone praying the wedding would happen before the creditors came knocking. While all this unfolded, the engaged couple themselves were often treated like decorative props. The bride-to-be might sit quietly during discussions, hands folded, eyes downcast, the living embodiment of etiquette and patience. Her opinions mattered about as much as the household cats. If she dared to express actual emotion, her mother would gently redirect the conversation. "Yes, dear, but let's focus on the silver allowance." Once the terms were set, both families would engage in weeks of subtle espionage. Servants whispered about spending habits, tailors shared gossip about debts, and society pages hinted at moral failings disguised as melancholy dispositions. Every detail mattered. One careless cousin's affair in 1824 could still haunt a match 50 years later, and heaven help you if the families didn't get along. Victorian etiquette demanded civility, but that didn't prevent Cold Wars conducted via calling cards and passive-aggressive compliments. "What a lovely home," one mother-in-law might coo. "So quaint, it reminds me of our gardener's cottage." Insults were delivered in sugar-coated syllables, each one dipped in venom and wrapped in lace. The tension didn't end when the papers were signed. The engagement itself became a public performance, a months-long showcase of harmony between families who secretly loathed each other. Dinners were held, introductions made, and newspapers gleefully printed every detail. Miss Fairchild to wed Mr. Pembroke, uniting two venerable families and 3 decades of quiet resentment. And while it was all very civil on the surface, everyone knew what was really at stake: social mobility. Marrying up could redeem an entire bloodline, marrying down could doom it. Aristocrats sought wealthy industrialists to refill dwindling coffers, while newly rich merchants sought noble titles like collectible items. Marriages were the social glue, and occasionally the social glue trap, of the Victorian class system. Even after all that, disaster could still strike. A rumoured debt, a sudden illness, or an indiscreet letter could send negotiations crumbling overnight. Engagements were broken off with brutal efficiency, usually by the families, not the couple. The rejected party was left with nothing but gossip, humiliation, and a fainting couch for moral support. So when you think of Victorian engagements, don't picture hearts and flowers. Picture 2 boardrooms merged over tea, both sides pretending it's about love, while calculating the long-term dividends of respectability. The bride didn't just marry a man, she acquired an in-law support group she'd never applied for, and they'd all be managing her emotional portfolio for the rest of her life. So you've survived the proposal and the family negotiations. Congratulations, you're officially engaged. Unfortunately, you're also no longer a person. You're a walking, talking announcement. In Victorian Britain, getting engaged was like being promoted to a celebrity without any of the fun parts. Everyone knew your name, everyone had opinions about you, and everyone expected you to behave like a porcelain doll on moral probation. Once that ring appeared, or more accurately, once a newspaper notice confirmed it, your life became public property. Strangers would read your engagement announcement over breakfast with their tea and toast, comment on your complexion, and speculate on whether the match was advantageous. You didn't just gain a fiancé, you gained an audience. Victorian society adored engagements because they offered something everyone loved: gossip with paperwork. Newspapers gleefully printed who was marrying whom, down to their family lineages and sometimes their dowry amounts. For the elite, an engagement notice was less about love and more about branding, a public declaration that your family still had enough money and manners to marry well. For the middle class, it was a signal that you had officially made it. But the engagement period wasn't a romantic blur of flowers and whispers. It was a social marathon. You were expected to navigate months, sometimes years, of scrutiny without tripping over etiquette. The fiancé had to appear blissful but not boastful, affectionate but not improper, modest but not boring. Her fiancé, meanwhile, was expected to show devotion without enthusiasm. Passion was frowned upon, but punctuality was admired. Even the length of the engagement was a matter of public judgment. If it was too short, tongues wagged about impropriety. If it was too long, people assumed someone was hiding a dark secret: debt, disease, or perhaps a suspicious fondness for poetry. As one etiquette guide delicately put it, a brief engagement suggests haste, a prolonged one, hesitation. Translation: you're doomed either way, and while modern couples might celebrate an engagement with a party or a photo shoot, Victorian couples celebrated it with strict supervision. Engaged pairs could now be seen together more frequently, but never alone. Walks were acceptable if accompanied by a chaperone, ideally a mother, aunt, or someone whose hobby was ruining fun. Even when they did steal a few private moments, propriety required conversation topics like the weather, the Psalms, or possibly the moral value of wallpaper. Physical contact? Out of the question. Even a hand placed too warmly on an arm could trigger scandal. In one real 19th century etiquette case, A young woman's engagement was broken off after someone saw her fiancé adjusting her shawl in public, a gesture deemed intimate. Adjusting a shawl? Clearly, civilization was hanging by a thread, literally. Engagement gifts, too, came with the rules that could fill a small encyclopedia. The gentleman might give his fiancée a ring, usually gold with a diamond or gemstone, but she couldn't wear it on her left hand until marriage. Doing so prematurely was considered presumptuous. The bride-to-be could embroider handkerchiefs or write letters, but never send overly personal tokens. Nothing said eternal devotion like a monogrammed bookmark delivered under moral surveillance. Then came the most delicate dance of all, social appearances. The couple was expected to attend dinners, teas and church services together, serving as living proof of Victorian virtue. They had to smile at each other across rooms without appearing too giddy. Love was to be displayed like fine china, visible, admired, but never touched. For the bride, every day became a rehearsal for her future role. She was expected to host small gatherings to show she could manage a household, choose tasteful clothing that reflected her fiancé's social class, and never ever express an independent opinion. Too much intellect made a woman alarming. Too little made her insipid. Being engaged in the Victorian era was like walking a tightrope over a pit of moral crocodiles. The couple's correspondence was equally perilous. Letters were both a lifeline and a liability. Love letters could be used as evidence if the engagement broke off. Yes, evidence. There were actual court cases over sentimental notes, especially if one party tried to sue for breach of promise. A genuine Victorian legal concept where breaking an engagement could result in financial compensation. Imagine modern dating with legal repercussions for ghosting. That's Victorian romance for you. The social pressure didn't end there. Families used the engagement period as a display of wealth and taste. Both sides hosted dinners to flaunt their table settings, servants and pianists. The bride's trousseau, her pre-marriage wardrobe, became a public obsession. Each new gown or bonnet was whispered about in drawing rooms, as though it were a royal coronation. But behind the satin gloves and polite smiles, anxiety simmered. The fiancée had to worry about everything from her complexion to her conversation topics. A single misstep could jeopardize the match. Even fainting in church risked public ridicule, not from lack of health, but from emotional instability. In an age where women were judged by their calmness, a well-timed faint could ruin a family's season. For the man, it wasn't much easier. His job was to maintain appearances, write letters promptly, visit regularly, never appear too busy, lest it imply waning affection, but also never too eager, lest it seem desperate. Love was something you proved through consistent etiquette, not emotional sincerity. So the engagement period, the time between yes and I do, wasn't a celebration of love. It was a probation period for social worthiness. The couple's real relationship existed only in glances, letters, and the silent prayer that no relative said something embarrassing at dinner. If your engagement was too short, you were scandalous. Too long, you were suspicious. There was no winning, only waiting. In the Victorian world, love might conquer all, but etiquette conquered love. There are two universal truths in Victorian Britain. Tea fixes everything and fashion ruins everyone. And nowhere was this more visible, or more physically painful, than in the Victorian wedding dress. To the modern eye, these gowns seem romantic, elegant and dreamlike, but to the women wearing them, they were less bridal fantasy and more personal torture device stitched with pearls. Before Queen Victoria married Prince Albert in 1840, wedding dresses came in all colours. Blue was popular for purity, silver for the wealthy, and even black for practicality, because why waste a good dress on one event when you could also wear it to funerals? But when Victoria walked down the aisle in shimmering white silk satin trimmed with orange blossoms, the world collectively gasped. Suddenly, white became the symbol of innocence, virtue, and, most importantly, money. After all, white showed every speck of dirt, meaning only someone rich enough to afford servants could risk wearing it. From that point forward, every ambitious bride in Britain wanted to look like a queen, even if she was marrying someone who still borrowed his mother's carriage. The Victorian wedding dress evolved into an expensive, elaborate ordeal, a wearable monument to social aspiration. Silk, satin, lace, tulle and embroidery were layered like geological strata until the poor bride could barely move without assistance. If it didn't weigh at least 20 pounds, it wasn't respectable. The corset, of course, was the centrepiece of this elegant imprisonment. It was made of whalebone, actual bone, because Victorians never met a living creature they didn't want to turn into clothing, and pulled tight enough to make internal organs reconsider their life choices. On her wedding day, a bride was expected to embody grace and delicacy, which translated to conscious but fragile. Servants often had to help her dress in stages, tightening laces inch by inch, until she could no longer draw a full breath. And the veil, ah yes, the veil. What began as a light piece of lace to symbolize modesty evolved into something that could double as a ship's sail. Veils were often so long they required attendants to carry them like holy relics. For outdoor weddings, they acted as accidental insect traps. There are recorded instances of brides nearly toppling over when a gust of wind caught the veil, a dramatic but undignified entrance. Each layer of the dress was symbolic. Lace meant refinement, silk meant status, pearls meant purity, and fainting meant success. Brides didn't just wear their wealth, they displayed it with the subtlety of a chandelier. The gowns sparkled with seed pearls, glass beads, and occasionally genuine gemstones sewn into bodices. The wealthier the family, the more absurd the detailing. Some dresses were so heavy with embellishment they needed inner supports to keep them upright, turning the bride into a human sculpture with limited warranty. For the working classes, however, this kind of extravagance was impossible. But imitation was everything in Victorian society. So clever seamstresses found ways to copy upper-class styles using cheaper fabrics, muslin instead of silk, cotton lace instead of chantilly. Some brides dyed their dresses light cream or beige to resemble bridal white, while remaining practical enough to reuse later. A truly resourceful woman could walk down the aisle one day and wear the same gown to her cousin's funeral the next, with minor adjustments and significantly fewer flowers. Even for those who could afford the real thing, the price was staggering. A typical upper-class wedding gown could cost the equivalent of several years' wages for a servant. And that didn't include accessories. Gloves, slippers, fans, jewellery and the bouquet, all of which had to harmonise perfectly, lest someone whisper that her lace was provincial once the ceremony began. The dress became both a spectacle and a hazard. Brides manoeuvred through churches like galleons navigating fog. The combination of silk, corsetry and candlelight made fire a genuine threat. The press loved these moments. Newspapers occasionally reported tragic bridal accidents involving veils and candelabras, because even matrimony couldn't escape Victorian melodrama. And yet, despite the discomfort, women embraced the ritual with religious devotion. The dress wasn't just an outfit, it was a declaration. In a society obsessed with appearances, a perfect gown proved that a woman, and her family, understood her social duty, to look flawless while suffering silently. It was the ideal metaphor for Victorian womanhood, elegance built on endurance. After the wedding, the dress faced its next challenge: preservation. Many brides stored their gowns in cedar chests wrapped in muslin to prevent moth damage and moral decay. Others had sections repurposed into christening gowns for future children. A sentimental recycling program before sustainability was trendy. A few daring women even cut up their wedding dresses for fashionable evening gowns, shocking society but delighting their wardrobes. And so the Victorian wedding dress became one of history's most brilliant contradictions, a garment meant to symbolise joy, constructed to guarantee discomfort. Every stitch whispered devotion, not necessarily to the groom, but to the social expectations that demanded beauty above breathing. So when we gaze at those sepia photographs of serene brides, we should remember that behind the calm smiles were women calculating how many more minutes they could stand before collapsing into a heap of lace and silk. If you could breathe easily, it clearly wasn't couture. Victorian fashion didn't just make statements, it made medical conditions. When Queen Victoria married Prince Albert in 1840, she didn't just start a royal romance, she launched a national fashion crisis. Before her, brides wore whatever colour looked flattering, affordable, or rewearable. A nice pastel, perhaps, or blue, the traditional colour of purity. But Victoria stepped out in shimmering white silk satin, trimmed with orange blossoms, and an empire already drunk on etiquette lost its collective mind. Within days, white stopped being just a colour. It became a moral statement, a social ladder, and a full-time job. What had been a personal choice for one royal bride turned into a moral obligation for everyone else. The message was clear. Wear white or risk being labelled impure, provincial, or, heaven forbid, practical. White wasn't chosen by kids, it was pure. It was chosen because it was impossible. The Victorians loved a challenge, especially one that proved who had servants. A spotless white dress meant you had the wealth to keep it spotless. After all, only the truly rich could afford an outfit that could be ruined by a strong breeze, a sneeze, or proximity to pudding. And so, across Britain, a new industry of suffering was born. Brides and dressmakers scrambled to imitate Victoria's gown, each version more blindingly white than the last. But Victorian fabric didn't come pre-bleached. It had to be treated with chemicals that could melt your fingertips faster than romance itself. Dressmakers worked with caustic soda, chloride of lime, and even arsenic to achieve that angelic whiteness. Because nothing says purity like a hint of poison, laundry became both an art and an endurance test. To keep fabrics pristine, laundresses soaked, boiled, and scrubbed until the water resembled a tragic snowstorm. The women doing the bleaching inhaled fumes strong enough to kill a sense of optimism. Many ended up with burns on their hands, damaged lungs, or fading eyesight, the true casualties of Victorian virtue. When etiquette manuals spoke of the radiance of white, they forgot to mention it often came at the cost of someone else's corneas. But for brides there was no alternative. White was no longer just fashionable, it was moralised. A pale gown symbolised virginity, modesty, and moral excellence, even if the bride's fiancé was a walking scandal with a monocle problem. Victorian society had a fascinating double standard. Men's reputations could be rehabilitated, but a woman's was as delicate as lace. One coffee stain, and it was over. Magazines like The Queen and the Ladies' Treasury spread the gospel of white, insisting that a spotless gown reflects a spotless soul, and possibly a spotless maid. The moral undertones grew so intense that even a cream-coloured dress could spark whispers. She chose ivory, someone might murmur, eyes narrowing, suggestive. For the upper classes, this obsession reached ludicrous heights. Brides wore layers upon layers of white silk lace and tulle, each one whiter than the last, as though they were auditioning to become clouds. Servants were tasked with guarding the dress at all times. Even sitting was a logistical operation requiring cushions, attendants, and at least one prayer. Some brides reportedly fasted the day before the ceremony to ensure their corsets fit properly, and nothing stained that divine fabric. Meanwhile, middle-class women, desperate to emulate the elite, went bankrupt trying to afford the same ghostly aesthetic. A good imitation silk could cost half a year's income, but appearances were everything. For those who couldn't buy new fabric, enterprising brides bleached their old gowns until they were white enough to pass, much like the Victorian version of social climbing. Of course, the irony was that the very thing symbolising virtue, white, also symbolised vanity. It screamed, "Look at me! I am pure, wealthy, and flammable!" Entire ceremonies revolved around preserving the illusion. Brides avoided sunlight, food, and physical exertion to maintain that sacred whiteness. Imagine a room full of pale, trembling brides trying not to faint near the soup course. That's Victorian glamour in action. Even photographers got in on the craze. When wedding photography became popular in the 1860s, brides discovered a new horror. early cameras made white dresses glow like radioactive ghosts, but rather than reconsider their choices, Victorians doubled down. "The more blinding the better," declared one etiquette column. "A radiant bride is the mark of true refinement." For working-class women, the obsession was both inspiring and impossible. Some borrowed white shawls or lace collars to suggest bridal purity, while others dyed simple cotton dresses pale grey, the colour of compromise, because purity apparently came in shades depending on your budget. And let's not forget the final indignity. After all the expense and effort, the dress was worn once. White silk couldn't be reused without gossip. It was too memorable, too symbolic. A second appearance in the same gown would invite scandal, as though recycling fabric might also recycle sins. So the dress was packed away, often to yellow quietly in storage, while the bride learned that married life involved less purity and more laundry. In truth, the white dress wasn't just a symbol of moral virtue, it was a symbol of the Victorian paradox itself. A society obsessed with appearances but blind to the labour, pain and hypocrisy underneath. So the next time you see an old photograph of a Victorian bride in dazzling white, remember that her gown was less about innocence and more about image management. Beneath the lace and sanctity lay the truth, the endless scrubbing, the chemical burns and the quiet knowledge that purity had a high maintenance cost. Victorian purity wasn't about morals, it was about surviving laundry day. White might symbolise innocence, but it mainly represented the courage to wear bleach and smile through the fumes. For most Victorian brides, the wedding day wasn't just a celebration of love, it was a carefully choreographed act of survival. Between the silk, the lace, the social expectations, and the fainting relatives, one final enemy lurked beneath it all: the corset. The cruelest part? It wasn't hidden because it was subtle. It was hidden because every woman was forced to pretend she loved it. Victorian society worshipped the hourglass figure like it was a moral virtue. A tiny waist meant refinement, self-discipline, and a good family. A natural waistline, on the other hand, suggested laziness, indulgence, and possibly communism. The corset became both armour and cage, a contraption of whalebone, steel, and stubbornness designed to mould the female body into the ideal shape. Tiny waist, lifted bust, and a posture so straight it could double as a sundial. On an ordinary day, wearing a corset was uncomfortable. On a wedding day, it was warfare. Brides were expected to look angelic, delicate, and faintly ethereal, which meant tight lacing until internal organs began writing complaint letters to management. The process started early that morning. A maid or mother would help the bride into her chemise and petticoats before beginning the slow, merciless tightening ritual. Each pull on the laces was accompanied by phrases like, "Almost there, dear," or "Hold still, you'll get used to it eventually." Spoiler, she never did. Some brides trained for weeks beforehand, gradually cinching their waists smaller each day. This wasn't fitness, it was endurance theatre. The goal was to reduce the waist to a perfect 18 or 20 inches, depending on one's class and ambition. The result: exquisite posture, impressive silhouettes, and zero lung capacity. Many etiquette manuals quietly recommended rest periods during the ceremony, which is Victorian for sit down before you collapse into the organ player. Doctors, bless their horrified hearts, began warning about the dangers of tight lacing. They reported everything from fainting fits and compressed ribs to dislocated organs. One particularly alarmed physician wrote that corsets could displace the liver and distort the heart. Society's response? But does it look good? Because in Victorian Britain, beauty always outranked biology. And yet the corset wasn't just torture, it was moral theatre. A small waist signified control and virtue. A woman who laced too loosely risked being seen as morally loose as well. A rigid spine and contained breath were considered signs of good breeding. The more restricted your breathing, the more respectable your family. By that logic, the fainting bride wasn't fragile, she was fashionable. During the ceremony itself, many brides stood with their elbows delicately bent and their shoulders pulled back, smiling serenely while fighting for oxygen. There are countless diary entries and letters describing brides who swooned mid-vow, prompting grooms to panic while the minister carried on bravely. In sickness and in health took on a new meaning when the sickness was self-inflicted compression. Servants would rush forward to loosen a few laces discreetly, but never too much, lest anyone notice the scandalous act of breathing freely in public. Corsets also created a delightful cascade of side effects that only the Victorians could have called ladylike. Bruised ribs, indigestion, shallow breathing, and headaches were all common. One woman confessed in a letter that she couldn't laugh without a sharp pain below the breastbone, but added cheerfully that it was worth it for the silhouette. Because nothing says romance like developing chronic pain in the pursuit of elegance. The situation was made worse by wedding gowns themselves, which were designed to accentuate the corset's work. Layers of fabric pressed down on already restricted torsos, while heavy skirts and bustles altered balance completely. Brides often described feeling as though they were floating, a poetic euphemism for losing circulation. And of course, there was no taking it off after the ceremony. The corset stayed on through the wedding breakfast, the photo session, and the endless handshakes with relatives who all said the same thing. "You look radiant." My dear, she did, mostly from lack of oxygen. Meanwhile, fashion magazines and advertisements made sure women felt the pressure, literally and socially. Corset makers promised comfort and elegance combined, a claim as believable as a modern gym ad promising effortless abs. Illustrations showed impossibly slender brides standing proudly beside men who looked ready to faint in sympathy. Behind the illusion was an industry profiting from collective breath-holding. Some rebellious women did begin pushing back in the later decades of the century. Health reformers, early feminists, and a few brave doctors denounced the corset as a vice of civilization. A small movement known as the Rational Dress Society even formed in the 1880s, promoting less restrictive clothing. Their message: women should be able to move, breathe, and live without collapsing. Society's response was polite horror, because clearly if women could move freely, what next? Democracy? Still, the corset endured until the 20th century, tightening its grip on both bodies and culture. For Victorian brides, it was more than underwear. It was destiny, a literal shaping of one's body into the image of virtue, obedience, and sacrifice. The perfect symbol, really, for a marriage where comfort came second to appearance. So when the bride finally made it down the aisle, pale and trembling but upright, everyone whispered about how beautiful she looked. No one mentioned the faint buzzing in her ears, the numb fingers, or the growing certainty that she might not survive the cake cutting. Nothing says eternal love like passing out halfway through "I do." The Victorian corset didn't just shape the body, it shaped the entire definition of suffering gracefully. If you were a Victorian groom, your wedding wasn't a celebration, it was a financial ambush in formal wear. From the moment you slipped a ring on her finger, society slipped a hand into your pocket. You were expected to fund the ceremony, impress 2 families, and radiate calm composure while hemorrhaging money at an alarming rate. In short, the bride got the lace, the flowers, and the glory. You got the bill. Victorian marriage customs were clear on one thing. The groom's most vital organ was his wallet. Love was nice, of course, but solvency was say before you could even propose. You were expected to prove financial stability, not just enough to support a wife, but enough to sustain her in the style to which she'd like to become accustomed. A gentleman didn't just marry a woman, he married her expectations, her family's judgment, and her dressmaker's entire business model. Let's start with the ring, the most deceptively small but ruinously expensive part of the ordeal. Diamonds weren't yet the forever cliché they'd later become, but they were still a glittering status symbol. Victorians loved symbolism, so rings often featured intertwined serpents representing eternity, seed pearls, fertility, or forget-me-nots because subtlety was dead. If your fiancé's friends gasped audibly at the ring's sparkle, congratulations, you'd passed the first financial test. If they didn't, you might as well elope in shame. Next came the ceremony costs, which varied by class but shared one unifying theme: excess. A fashionable wedding required a church large enough to impress, flowers enough to suffocate it, and carriages enough to block half the street. Even modest ceremonies expected a carriage for the bride, another for her parents, and sometimes one just for the dress, the groom's task: pay for every horse that neighed in her honour. Then there were the fees and gifts. The groom paid the clergyman, tipped the organist, rewarded the sexton, and occasionally funded decorative extras like new altar candles or extra choir boys, because piety looks better in chorus. And while the bride received a flood of silverware, teacups, and ornamental nightmares from well-wishers, the groom's main gift was usually a debt headache and a polite smile. A proper Victorian groom also funded the honeymoon, which, contrary to modern belief, was not always romantic bliss. Often the honeymoon was a lengthy tour of relatives, designed to showcase the new bride like an expensive acquisition. This meant more carriages, more hotels, and more socially acceptable exhaustion. It wasn't uncommon for couples to return from their honeymoon looking less love-struck and more financially concussed. If that weren't enough, the groom also faced wardrobe warfare. He had to look respectable, which in Victorian terms meant dressing like a butler who'd won the lottery. Tailcoats, waistcoats, gloves, hats, and polished shoes all had to be pristine. His boutonniere, a flower pinned to his lapel, was chosen to match the bride's bouquet, ensuring he looked both stylish and symbolically trapped. Middle and working class grooms didn't escape unscathed either. Even if they couldn't afford silk cravats or ivory-handled canes, they were expected to stretch every penny to create the illusion of affluence. The local tailor would work overtime producing garments that screamed gentleman while whispering installment plan. And God help the man who wore last season's cut. Social humiliation cost nothing, but it could last forever. Of course, the ultimate measure of a groom's success wasn't how well he looked, but how much he spent. The wedding breakfast, the post-ceremony feast, was his responsibility, and the more ostentatious the better. Guests expected fine wines, meats, and enough puddings to induce collective regret. For the upper classes, this meant multiple courses, footmen in livery, and speeches that lasted longer than some marriages. For the middle classes, it often meant debt, carefully disguised as hospitality. And yet, through all of this, the groom was expected to maintain the serene demeanour of a marble statue. While the bride fluttered with excitement and lace, he stood beside her as the human equivalent of a checkbook with hair. During the ceremony, his role was to stand still, look respectable and not faint, because fainting was her department. The newspapers rarely mentioned the groom's suffering. They praised the bride's beauty, her gown, her floral arrangements, and her radiant expression. The groom's appearance was summarized in one line: "The groom looked every inch the gentleman." Translation: he hasn't cried publicly yet. It's worth noting that Victorian marriage laws also reinforced this dynamic. Once married, a woman's property legally became her husband, but ironically, he often had to go bankrupt getting her there. The social cost of not marrying appropriately could be worse than debt, so many men spent years recovering financially from their weddings. As one 19th century diarist quipped, "A man does not so much wed a wife as he finances a pageant." There were exceptions, of course. Some marriages were modest, quiet affairs, usually the kind that didn't make it into the society pages. But for most grooms, the ordeal was a test of endurance, a public performance of wealth and respectability that often ended in an empty wallet and a cramp in the jaw from forced smiling. Still, despite the absurdity, many men played their part willingly. Marriage was a symbol of stability, success, and social ascension. Paying for it all was the price of admission to adulthood and to respectability. After all, in Victorian Britain, the only thing worse than overspending on a wedding was not being able to afford one at all. So when the vows were spoken, for richer, for poorer, the groom already knew which half he'd fulfill first. Victorian marriage vows came with a hidden line: for richer, or please pretend you are. The bride got the romance, the groom got the receipt, If you think planning a modern wedding guest list is stressful, imagine doing it in Victorian England, a society where every single name on that list could determine your family's reputation for the next 50 years. The Victorians managed to turn what should have been a simple act of celebration into a logistical nightmare, so tangled it could have been studied by military strategists. Forget cold feet, Victorian brides feared cold shoulders from uninvited aunts. Invitations weren't merely bits of paper, they were social missiles aimed with deadly precision. Sending one to the wrong person, or worse, not sending one to the right person, could destroy friendships, ignite feuds, and send entire drawing rooms into civil war. Weddings weren't just family affairs, they were public demonstrations of social hierarchy. Every invitation said something about status, wealth, alliances, and who your family thought was worth the good china. It all began with the writing of the invitations, which was both an art and a trap. They had to be handwritten by someone with beautiful penmanship, preferably not the groom, on heavy cream paper embossed with the family crest if you had one, or something vaguely leafy if you didn't. The ink had to be black. Blue was for business, red was for scandal. Even the phrasing mattered. You couldn't just say you're invited. You had to say something along the lines of, Mr. and Mrs. Percival Wainscott request the honour of your presence at the marriage of their daughter Adelaide to Mr. Charles Pembroke at St. Mary's, Kensington, on Thursday the 15th of June, 1874, at 1 o'clock precisely. Notice the phrasing. Honour with a U, because Americans were gauche, and presence instead of attendance, because attendance sounded like something servants did. Even capitalisation carried meaning. Forget a comma and your social standing dropped a notch. Once the text was approved, an army of stationers and messengers took over. The invitations had to be sent 6 to 8 weeks in advance, a scandalous rush job if it was only 4, and each one hand-delivered by a footman or post depending on your budget. The family footman was the Victorian equivalent of a courier service, except slower and more judgmental. But the real chaos began when the invitations landed, because Victorians didn't just RSVP, they strategized. Attending a wedding wasn't a simple matter of affection, it was a move on the chessboard of social advancement. If you were seen at a high society wedding, it meant your own family was on the rise. Declining without an excellent excuse, tuberculosis usually worked, was a calculated insult. Some guests even replied late on purpose to feign superiority. Nothing said, I'm important, like implying you had better invitations waiting. And then came the problem of how many people to invite. Too few, and you appeared stingy. Too many, and you appeared desperate. The ideal number depended on your social tier. Aristocrats invited hundreds, sometimes including people they barely knew, because nothing demonstrated class like overcrowding your church with acquaintances. The middle class, desperate to imitate them, often over-invited as well, leading to rows of guests fainting in the aisles because someone forgot to consider oxygen flow. Family politics made it worse. Every mother-in-law, cousin, and distant great-uncle had an opinion about who must be invited. You can't leave out cousin Beatrice, someone would hiss, even if she did elope with a footman. It's family. Meanwhile, inviting cousin Beatrice risked offending Aunt Matilda, who hadn't spoken to her since 1849. The entire process was like defusing a bomb with a lace glove. The seating arrangements at the wedding breakfast could trigger even more disaster. Who sat next to whom was a delicate balancing act. The vicar couldn't sit beside the divorcee. The wealthy aunt mustn't sit beside the one who smelled of mothballs and opinions. And heaven forbid you place anyone of higher rank below someone inferior at the table. The wrong placement could cause more outrage than a duel. Of course, all this formality came at a cost, literally. Printing invitations, hiring messengers, and providing refreshments for all those carefully ranked guests added up. But what was money compared to the possibility of being mocked in the society pages? Newspapers often published guest lists from elite weddings, and everyone scoured them for gossip. Did you see who wasn't invited to the Wentworth wedding was a more dangerous sentence than, did you hear about the cholera outbreak? For the socially ambitious, every invitation sent was an act of self-promotion. Marrying into a higher class, invite everyone from the groom's circle, even if you couldn't stand them, hoping to rise in society, slip an invitation to a titled acquaintance and pray they accepted. It was the Victorian equivalent of influencer networking, but with more lace and passive aggression. Even the envelopes had their hierarchy. Titles and addresses had to be written in exact form. The Right Honourable Lord and Lady Fitzwilliam on one, Mr. and Mrs. Smythe on another. A single mistake, say addressing someone as Miss instead of Mrs., could ignite scandalous speculation about their marital status and moral character. For a society that barely tolerated divorce, that was practically starting a war. When the big day arrived, half the guests would still find something to complain about. The ink was too smudged. The font was too large. The bride's side invited tradespeople. And yet, if those same complainers hadn't been invited, they'd have been equally furious. There was no winning, only degrees of disaster. So the Victorian wedding invitation was more than a piece of stationery. It was a declaration of social order, a coded announcement of alliances, and an unspoken challenge to every rival family. For the bride and groom, it wasn't just about sharing joy, it was about surviving judgment. Forget cold feet. Victorian brides feared cold shoulders from uninvited aunts. The real I do was, I do solemnly swear not to offend anyone with my guest list. For the Victorians, a wedding ceremony wasn't a tender spiritual union. It was a public performance with pews. Once the invitations had been delivered, the dresses stitched, and the relatives weaponized, the final act unfolded inside the church, a place that for many guests functioned less as a house of God and more as a socially acceptable theatre. The morning of the ceremony began early, because punctuality was next to godliness, and lateness was next to ruin. The groom was expected to arrive first, ideally 20 minutes before the ceremony, so he could greet guests, calm his nerves, and stand there looking appropriately solemn, as if about to be executed for love. The bride, of course, arrived fashionably late, which everyone pretended not to expect while absolutely expecting it. The longer the wait, the more anticipation, the greater the drama. Then came the grand procession, a parade of lace, anxiety, and minor injuries. The organ struck up the wedding march, a piece so overused by the late 1800s that organists played it with the same enthusiasm as tax accountants filling forms. Bridesmaids glided ahead like decorative lanterns, scattering petals and panic. Finally, the bride appeared, gripping her father's arm for balance and oxygen, while guests twisted in their seats to assess her gown with the precision of art critics. The Victorian church ceremony was supposed to symbolise piety and restraint, but it often turned into a test of physical endurance. Churches were cold in winter, stifling in the summer, and always packed beyond reason. Guests stood shoulder to shoulder, whispering about lace quality, complexion, and whether the bride's family could really afford all this. The air smelled of candles, perfume, and suppressed judgment. At the altar, the couple stood rigid as marble, trying to appear holy while silently calculating how long they could stand before fainting. The vicar, meanwhile, saw his moment of glory. For some, the wedding sermon was a sacred duty. For others, it was showtime. Victorian clergy loved to moralise. Marriage wasn't just about love. It was about duty, obedience, and keeping one's moral spine as straight as one's corset. Sermons routinely warned brides against vanity, idleness, and neglecting the household sphere. Grooms were reminded to act as moral guardians, spiritual leaders, and part-time landlords. Everyone else was reminded to fear temptation and behave. These sermons could go on for ages. The typical Victorian wedding lasted an hour or more, half of which involved the minister explaining why everyone should repent before cutting the cake. Guests sat fanning themselves with programmes, eyes glazing over, pretending to listen while mentally ranking everyone's outfits. The phrase, "you may kiss the bride," might be what people remember, but in reality, it came buried under 45 minutes of moral thunder. You came for vows, but you stayed for the sermon on sin, and heaven help the couple if the officiating clergyman was ambitious. Some treated weddings as audition pieces for church promotion. A little extra sermon flair, a few dramatic pauses, and a gentle tear shed over the sanctity of matrimony could earn a bishop's notice. For guests, however, it was a slow descent into purgatory. The occasional child crying or elderly aunt snoring provided much-needed comic relief. Meanwhile, decorum demanded absolute stillness. No one dared cough, sneeze, or shift noisily. The rustle of silk dresses was the loudest permissible sound. One wrong move could turn heads faster than a scandal in the Times. And woe to anyone who dropped a hymn book. It echoed like cannon fire. The vows themselves were both sacred and slightly terrifying. The bride had to promise to love, honour and obey, a phrase that made feminists and their corsets twitch. Refusing to say obey was technically allowed, but doing so was social suicide. The groom's vows were more lenient. He promised to love, honour and protect, as if preparing for mild outdoor adventures rather than lifelong domestic partnership. When it came time to exchange rings, nerves often took over. Slipping a ring onto a trembling gloved hand required the dexterity of a surgeon and the patience of a saint. Some bridesmaids kept smelling salts on standby for fainting brides or emotional mothers. Others discreetly dabbed at their eyes, partly from sentiment, partly from the thick candle smoke. And just when everyone thought it was over, the paperwork began. The signing of the marriage register was a formal, tedious ritual conducted in the vestry, that small, stuffy back room where the newlyweds, witnesses and minister crowded together to make it official. The groom signed neatly. The bride, still half dizzy from nerves and corsetry, often produced a shaky flourish that looked more like a desperate cry for help. Afterward, everyone filed out for the grand exit, a moment equal parts triumph and chaos. Church doors burst open, sunlight poured in, and guests pelted the couple with rice or flower petals, an ancient fertility symbol that also doubled as a tripping hazard. The newlyweds smiled heroically, blinking against the glare, while photographers lined them up for portraits that required standing still for an eternity. For the guests, freedom was finally at hand, though they'd soon have to endure the wedding breakfast, another round of etiquette warfare. But for now, they shuffled toward their carriages, murmuring polite congratulations while quietly debating whether the sermon was too long, the flowers too yellow, or the groom's tie too ambitious. As for the bride and groom, they'd survived the church circus, that holy spectacle of moral theatre, fashion parade and spiritual endurance. Their love might have brought them there, but it was etiquette, patience, and mild dehydration that got them through it. You came for vows, but you stayed for the 45-minute sermon on sin. The Victorian wedding ceremony, where love was sacred, posture was painful, and salvation came one hymn at a time. For the Victorians, wedding photography wasn't about capturing joy, it was about surviving it. In an age when smiling for the camera was considered both indecent and impractical, couples weren't so much photographed as immortalized against their will. The results were eerie, fascinating, and unintentionally hilarious. Sepia-toned proof that matrimony was a solemn affair, and that no one had blinked for 10 straight minutes. When photography first entered the wedding scene in the mid-19th century, it was nothing like the casual snapshots we take today. There were no candid kisses, no cake-smashing selfies, and definitely no bride tribe hashtags. A single photo was an event unto itself, a small scientific miracle wrapped in danger, chemistry, and a faint smell of burning magnesium. Victorians were both awed and terrified by this new technology, which they half suspected might capture not only your face but your soul. For some in-laws, this was a reason enough to avoid the camera altogether. A typical wedding photograph session required military coordination. The bride and groom would arrive at the photographer's studio, dressed in their full wedding finery, looking radiant and terrified. The equipment looked like something between an organ and a cannon. Giant wooden cameras on tripods, cloth hoods, and trays of mysterious liquids bubbling in the corner. The photographer himself often resembled an alchemist. Part artist, part chemist, part therapist for fainting brides. The real challenge wasn't posing, it was not moving. Early cameras required absurdly long exposure times, often anywhere from 20 seconds to several minutes depending on lighting and weather. The result? Every photo was a battle of endurance. Couples had to remain perfectly still, faces neutral, bodies stiff and eyes unblinking, lest their eternal image blur into a ghostly smear of matrimony. Smiling was strongly discouraged, not for aesthetic reasons, but practical ones. Try holding a smile for 5 minutes and you'll quickly understand why every Victorian looks like they're attending their own funeral. Brides, encased in corsets and yards of fabric, were the worst off. Balancing in heavy gowns while trying not to sway or breathe too obviously became a full-body workout. Photographers sometimes used hidden supports, metal rods and clamps positioned behind the subjects, to keep them upright. These devices were politely called posing stands, but in truth, they were scaffolds of suffering. The newlyweds were literally propped up by Victorian engineering, which may explain why they looked so unnaturally composed. Grooms fared no better. Dressed in thick woolen coats, they stood sweating under the studio lamps, one hand resting awkwardly on a table or chair for stability. It was the traditional respectable pose, but it mostly looked like they were too dizzy to stand on their own. Even their facial hair had to behave. A stray moustache hair could blur an entire exposure and doom the day's effort. For wealthier couples, the photography session might extend beyond the studio to elaborate outdoor portraits. This, of course, came with new hazards. Strong winds, unstable veils, and horse-drawn carriages that refused to stay still long enough for the camera to cooperate. Imagine holding your breath while balancing on damp grass and 30 pounds of satin, praying the photographer doesn't shout, "Just one more plate." It's no wonder Victorian brides looked haunted, they were. And then came the technical side. The process of developing photos involved dangerous chemicals like silver nitrate and collodion, substances that could stain your hands for days and ignite if handled carelessly. Photographers risked their eyesight and dignity to produce a single print. Even so, mishaps were common, plates overexposed, negatives being shattered, and sometimes, if the bride moved mid-exposure, she'd appear in the photo with two ghostly faces, a perfect visual metaphor for Victorian marriage, blurry, tense, and slightly cursed. But despite all this, photography quickly became the essential symbol of the modern respectability. Having a wedding portrait proved that your love was not only moral and sanctioned by God, but also approved by science. Families displayed these stiff, joyless images proudly in their parlours, sandwiched between portraits of ancestors who looked equally miserable. Visitors would peer at them and sigh, "Such a lovely couple," while privately wondering which one was already regretting everything. Working-class couples, unable to afford a photographer on the big day, often staged their portraits afterward, and sometimes weeks or even months later. In these cases, the bride would pull her wedding dress out of storage, assuming it hadn't already been repurposed into curtains, and the groom would rent a coat that fit well enough. They'd pose together in rented studios with borrowed props, painted backdrops of gardens, fake columns, and even papier-mâché arches. The illusion was everything, reality less so. There was also the peculiar Victorian belief that photographs carried moral weight. A well-composed, sober image reflected virtue and character. Smiling too widely suggested frivolity. Standing too close suggested impropriety. As one etiquette guide warned in 1882, a wedding portrait must convey dignity and restraint, lest levity diminish the solemnity of the occasion. Translation: look like you're being slowly petrified. Of course, not everyone followed the rules. Some daring couples, especially toward the end of the century, began experimenting with softer poses, the bride resting her hand on the groom's arm, a faint smile daring to appear. These modern photos scandalized the traditionalists. One critic even complained in the Ladies' Pictorial that such images were more suited to advertisements for soap than sacred vows, which, in fairness, might have been accurate, they looked suspiciously happy. Yet for all their stiffness, those sepia wedding portraits endure. Haunting, dignified, unintentionally funny. They remind us of a time when love was measured in posture, patience, and the ability to suppress a sneeze for the sake of posterity. The Victorian wedding photo wasn't about capturing joy, it was about manufacturing permanence. Even if the marriage didn't last, the photograph would. It would sit framed on mantelpieces for generations, gazing out at descendants with that unmistakable expression that said, "We suffered for this." Early wedding photos captured two things perfectly: love and neck cramps. Victorian photography, because nothing says eternal devotion like holding your breath for 6 minutes beside someone who might blink you into history. In modern weddings, flowers are there to look lovely, smell nice, and maybe make a few guests sneeze. But in Victorian times, a wedding bouquet wasn't just decoration. It was a deadly language, a minefield of hidden meanings wrapped in lace and stems. One wrong flower, and your beautiful wedding could become the social equivalent of an international incident. Forget floral arrangements. Victorian bouquets were relationship landmines. The Victorians were obsessed with symbolism, the kind of people who could turn a fern into a declaration of loyalty and a daisy into a dissertation on morality. This craze was called florography, or the language of flowers. Every bloom, leaf, and petal carried a coded message, and decoding them was a national pastime. Whole books were written on the subject, like the Illustrated Language of Flowers and Floral Telegraphy. Yes, that was an actual title. Allowing people to flirt, gossip, and even break up using nothing but bouquets. Naturally, this floral espionage extended to weddings, where every bloom carried social significance. The bride's bouquet wasn't chosen for beauty alone, it was a moral statement disguised as botany. Queen Victoria, the original wedding influencer, carried a small bouquet of myrtle, orange blossoms, and white roses, setting the standard for purity and fertility. After her, every respectable bride followed suit, or at least tried to. But not all flowers played nicely. Certain blossoms carried dangerous meanings. Take yellow roses, for instance. They meant jealousy. Red carnations, heartbreak, marigolds, grief and cruelty. Even innocent-looking lilacs hinted at first love, which was a risky choice if your fiancé wasn't technically your first. Choosing the wrong bouquet could make guests whisper, "Ah, symbolic honesty." Victorian for, "Oh dear, she's confessing something." And the combinations mattered just as much as the flowers themselves. Mixing ivy, faithfulness, with basil, hatred, was a floral oxymoron that could start family debates. Some etiquette books even provided sample safe combinations for brides too nervous to make a mistake. The Young Lady's Floral Guide of 1858 offered this cautious advice. One must not allow passion to overrule propriety in the selection of blooms. Translation: don't let your bouquet say you're too excited to be marrying him. The pressure was immense. Brides spent hours consulting floral dictionaries to ensure their arrangements expressed the right blend of chastity, affection, and mild enthusiasm. Florists, meanwhile, became half artisans and half psychologists, discreetly guiding clients away from risky blossoms. "Perhaps, madam," a florist might suggest gently, "we might remove the tiger lilies. They imply pride, and we wouldn't want that, would we?" Beyond meaning, flowers were also a class signal. The wealthy could afford exotic blooms like camellias, orchids, or gardenias, flowers that had to be shipped in from tropical colonies or greenhouse grown at ruinous cost. Displaying them was like wearing a floral resume that said, "We can afford imported humidity." The middle class, eager to imitate the upper crust, resorted to clever substitutions, cheaper blooms that looked expensive or heavily perfumed local varieties that masked any sense of thrift. And then there were the practical horrors. A proper Victorian bouquet could weigh several pounds, a fragrant cannonball of roses, myrtle, ferns and ribbons. Some were so massive that brides required both hands to hold them, or worse, an attendant to help. Given that brides were already balancing corsets, veils, and nerves, the bouquet became yet another test of endurance. A slip of the wrist and the whole thing might come crashing down mid-ceremony, an omen no one dared interpret aloud. Speaking of omens, Victorians took floral superstitions deadly seriously. Dropping a flower meant bad luck. Wilting before the ceremony was a disaster. A bee in the bouquet was divine punishment. Guests analysed every floral choice like tea leaves, convinced that fate itself could be foretold in a daffodil. One poor bride in Bath reportedly fainted when a rose petal fell from her bouquet during the vows. "A symbol of fading virtue!" gasped the vicar, helpfully making it worse. After the ceremony, the bouquet's symbolic life wasn't over. It was carefully preserved, sometimes pressed in a book, sometimes encased under glass, sometimes left to mummify on the mantelpiece like a botanical ghost of happiness past. Victorian sentimentality dictated that nothing connected to the day could be discarded. Brides who failed to keep their bouquet were accused of disrespecting memory itself. If she threw away the flowers, what else might she discard? Was an actual kind of drawing room speculation. And because Victorians loved making everything slightly more tragic, there was a morbid twist. Widows sometimes posed for memorial photographs holding their long-dried wedding bouquets. Nothing says eternal devotion like clutching a bundle of crumbling petals while staring mournfully into the middle distance. For those who couldn't afford elaborate floristry, creativity took over. Working-class brides often carried simple posies of local blooms, lavender, rosemary, daisies, chosen not for their meanings but for availability. Ironically, their humble simplicity later became fashionable among the upper classes, who praised such rustic bouquets as charmingly natural, never realising they were glorified budget arrangements. Even tossing the bouquet, a common modern ritual, had its Victorian roots, though the symbolism was darker. Brides sometimes gave away small floral tokens or single petals to unmarried friends as blessings, or, depending on interpretation, as good luck in finding your own misery soon. But the full toss-over-the-shoulder tradition didn't gain traction until later centuries. Most Victorian brides were far too attached emotionally and socially to risk flinging their coded message into the crowd. So while modern couples fret about floral colours matching the napkins, Victorians had to worry about accidentally implying infidelity through petal selection. It wasn't just a bouquet, it was an essay in virtue, arranged by committee, judged by everyone, and held aloft like a peace treaty between families who probably still disliked each other. The next time you see a stiff, unsmiling Victorian bride clutching a bouquet the size of a small child, remember this. She wasn't thinking about beauty or scent. She was thinking, please, for the love of God, don't let the basil touch the roses. Forget floral arrangements. Victorian bouquets were relationship landmines. Every petal had meaning, every leaf had consequences, and one misplaced marigold could turn happily ever after into socially exiled before dessert. In the grand pageantry of the Victorian wedding, few things loomed larger, literally, than the cake. Today's wedding confections are light, fluffy, and photogenic. The Victorian version, however, was more geological than culinary. A multi-tiered monument of dense fruit cake fortified with alcohol, cemented in icing so hard it could repel artillery. It wasn't dessert. It was an edible inheritance. Queen Victoria, as always, started the madness. Her 1840 wedding cake was a masterpiece of excess. A single-tier behemoth nearly 3 yards across and weighing over 300 pounds. It was so large it required a team of bakers, decorators, and possibly structural engineers to assemble. Decorated with statues of Britannia and Cupid, it set a standard no ordinary household could hope to replicate, though that didn't stop anyone from trying. After all, to Victorians, cake wasn't about flavour. It was about status. The recipe was deceptively simple. Take the heaviest ingredients you can find, raisins, currants, almonds, brandy, treacle, and enough flour to plug a chimney. Mix them into a single batter, and bake until it achieves the texture of a compressed cannonball. This was the fruitcake, the Victorian foundation of all wedding desserts. It was meant to last, to travel, and ideally to survive the apocalypse. Families often saved a slice for the first child's christening several years later, by which time it had aged into something between brandy-soaked granite and sweet archaeology. What made the Victorian wedding cake so distinctive wasn't just its density, but its armour. The outer layer was coated in royal icing, a substance so rock-solid it could double as household repair material. The process began with boiled sugar syrup beaten into egg whites until it reached the consistency of plaster. Once applied, it hardened into a glossy white crust that symbolised purity, prosperity, and the bride's moral fortitude. Because nothing says innocence like an icing you could file your nails with. Cutting the cake became a test of strength and social composure. The bride, often faint from corsetry and emotion, was expected to make the first slice herself, a task requiring not grace but upper body endurance. Etiquette books recommended she use a special silver knife, though many quietly suggested the assistance of a male relative to ensure success. It was one of the few times Victorian women were permitted to ask for help with a household task. After all, if you couldn't cut the cake, how would you possibly manage marriage? Once sliced, the cake was distributed with ritualistic precision. Guests were expected to receive their portion neatly wrapped in lace-trimmed boxes, to be consumed later or stored as a keepsake. It was believed that unmarried women who slept with a piece of wedding cake under their pillow would dream of their future husband. The superstition was so popular that bakeries sold small portions from celebrity weddings for hopeful spinsters to tuck beneath their heads, proof that even Victorian romance came with crumbs. The appearance of the cake mattered even more than its taste. Wealthy families competed to outdo one another with architectural designs. Columns, arches, sugar cherubs, entire scenes from Greek mythology, all painstakingly sculpted from hardened sugar paste. Some cakes featured miniature castles or edible replicas of the happy couple. Others were crowned with wax figures so lifelike they startled the guests. The more tiers, the better. A 3-tiered cake meant solid respectability. 4 or more suggested you were practically aristocracy, or overcompensating spectacularly. Middle-class couples, of course, couldn't afford such sugar fortresses, but they were determined to look like they could. Bakers began producing imitation multi-tiered cakes, hollow upper layers made of cardboard or wood, iced to perfection. Guests never knew the difference, unless they were unlucky enough to be served a piece from the fake section. One etiquette columnist warned against cutting from the top tiers, lest embarrassment ensue. It was the Victorian version of influencer fakery, a carefully frosted illusion of wealth. And then there were the ingredients. Victorian bakers had a free hand with additives. Lead-based whiteners gave icing a flawless, dangerous gleam. Arsenic and mercury occasionally made guest appearances in food colouring. Even the sugar itself, imported in vast quantities from the colonies, carried the bitter aftertaste of empire. Yet no one questioned the toxicity, because the cake wasn't meant to nourish, it was meant to impress. If you survived dessert, you'd proven your social worth and digestive resilience. For poorer families, the tradition took humbler forms. A small fruitcake with simple frosting or even a loaf-shaped sponge served the purpose. Some brides baked their own, saving on cost and ensuring the symbolism remained intact. Others borrowed leftover icing or decorative trimmings from wealthier acquaintances, hand-me-down glamour in confectionery form. Regardless of size or budget, a wedding without cake was unthinkable. As one etiquette manual sternly declared, it is better to forego champagne than cake, for the latter is the true emblem of union. Perhaps the most morbid tradition of all was the preservation of the top tier. Families wrapped it carefully and stored it away, sometimes for decades. It was meant to symbolise continuity, sweetness everlasting. But more often it symbolised microbial immortality. There are Victorian fruitcakes still in existence today, perfectly preserved, their sugar casing intact, daring modern scientists to sample a bite. Few are brave enough. By the late 19th century, wedding cakes had evolved from edible boulders into slightly lighter versions, with sponge cake and buttercream appearing for those reckless enough to value flavour over durability. Still, the symbolism endured. The cake remained the edible centrepiece of the wedding, a monument to prosperity, patience, and dental fortitude. So as the newlyweds smiled for their painfully long photographic session, the towering confection loomed nearby, gleaming, rigid, indestructible. Guests whispered in awe, servants prepared silver knives, and somewhere deep inside, the brandy-soaked raisins waited for their next victims. It wasn't dessert. It was an edible inheritance. The Victorian wedding cake didn't melt in your mouth. It challenged you to a duel and usually won. After the ceremony, the church air thick with candle smoke and moral lectures, guests shuffled eagerly toward the wedding breakfast, a phrase that sounds cheerful, until you realise it was neither a breakfast nor a break. It was a full-scale social endurance test disguised as a meal, complete with stiff etiquette, mysterious dishes, and the constant threat of public embarrassment. Breakfast didn't energise you. It just happened to you. The wedding breakfast tradition came from the days when couples fasted before the ceremony, a spiritual cleanse before legally merging debts. After the vows, they broke their fast with family and friends, hence the name. By the Victorian era, this quaint custom had evolved into an elaborate banquet that began around midday and could last for hours. There was no bacon and eggs in sight, only multi-course displays of wealth, formality, and digestive courage. Menus varied by class, but even modest households followed the same rules of excess. The table had to groan under the weight of food. For the upper crust, this meant pyramids of lobster, roasted fowl, jellied meats, blancmange, trifle, ices, and an entire cold buffet arranged like edible architecture. The middle class imitated as best they could, substituting smaller roasts and more jelly. In all cases, the goal was to display refinement through overcomplication. The Victorian obsession with etiquette reached its apogee here. Guests were seated according to rank, not by age, friendship, or proximity to the happy couple, but by invisible hierarchies understood only by mothers and etiquette manuals. The bride and groom sat at the centre of a long table like decorative trophies, flanked by family dignitaries who despised each other. Servants scurried about, refilling champagne and silently judging everyone's table manners. Everything had rules. How to sit straight but not military, how to hold your fork downward, never shovel-like, how to eat soup, tilt away, not toward, a heaven forbid you slurped, and crucially, how to pretend to enjoy dishes you couldn't identify. Aspic-covered meats, glistening lumps of gelatinous mystery, were a Victorian favourite. Chicken, ham or fish were suspended in translucent jelly like insects in amber, proving that progress and good taste didn't always evolve together. If you were lucky, you might also encounter collared eel, calf's foot jelly, or the ever-controversial mock turtle soup, a dish whose name offered hope and regret in equal measure. Vegetarian guests, those rare, possibly heretical creatures, were offered little sympathy. Vegetables were boiled to death as a matter of moral principle. As the bride and groom picked politely at their food, the guests whispered and observed. Too much appetite in a bride was unseemly. It suggested passion, or worse, digestion. She was expected to smile faintly, nibble at a crumb, and appear blissfully unaware of hunger. The groom was allowed to eat, but only neatly. Nothing could ruin a man's social standing faster than gravy stains on a waistcoat. Conversation was both mandatory and dangerous. Victorians loved small talk, but small talk at a wedding breakfast was an art form designed to reveal whether you were fit for society. Guests discussed the weather, the flowers, the sermon length, and occasionally the geopolitical implications of the pudding. Anything remotely personal, especially about love, was taboo. A bridegroom declaring affection too openly risked being labelled vulgar. After all, everyone already knew they were married. No need to rub it in with emotion. Then came the toasts. Oh, the toasts. One by one, guests rose to deliver lengthy speeches in honour of the couple, often blending congratulations with moral instruction. The father of the bride would begin, waxing poetic about virtue, family, and his financial losses. The clergyman followed, reminding everyone that marriage was a sacred duty, not an indulgence. Then came the best man, whose speech was the only one anyone secretly looked forward to, mostly to see how many jokes he could tell before someone fainted. Champagne, meanwhile, flowed freely, at least for the men. Women were expected to sip demurely, lest anyone accuse them of tipsiness. Alcohol was both a symbol of celebration and a test of restraint. The temperance movement was in full swing, and at some middle-class weddings, wine was replaced by lemonade or moral punch. Nothing kills the mood like toasting eternal love with tepid citrus water. After hours of eating, clinking glasses, and sitting bolt upright, guests were finally released from the table to admire the wedding cake. But even then, decorum ruled. You couldn't just stand, you had to rise gracefully. You couldn't talk about how much your feet hurt. You had to murmur, "What a lovely celebration," before limping discreetly toward the door. For working-class couples, the wedding breakfast was often held in a public house or family kitchen, far from the chandeliers and etiquette nightmares of the elite. There it was actually joyful beer, laughter, roast meats, and honest dancing. Plates might not match, but spirits were high, and no one fainted over soup spoon angles. Ironically, these humble meals often captured the thing Victorian society forgot, that weddings were supposed to be fun. But in middle and upper class homes, where status was measured in cutlery, joy had to stay within strict limits. The wedding breakfast was not for pleasure, it was for performance. It was the final examination into respectability before the newlyweds escaped to their honeymoon. And, hopefully, food that didn't quiver. So while the guests dabbed their lips, whispered polite gossip, and congratulated themselves on surviving another social ordeal, the truth lingered unspoken. No one was really full, no one was truly comfortable, and everyone secretly envied the cook. Breakfast didn't energize you, it just happened to you. The Victorian wedding breakfast wasn't a meal, it was a moral obstacle course with silverware. When the last toast was made, the last soup spoon polished, and the bride had survived the perilous ordeal of eating while being watched, the Victorian wedding should have gently concluded, but it never did. Once the speeches ended, and the champagne started whispering in everyone's bloodstream, the carefully orchestrated pageant of manners collapsed into something more human and far more chaotic. Every good Victorian wedding ended with regret, and someone losing a monocle. The Victorians spent the entire day proceeding to be paragons of virtue. But by the end of the reception, even the most rigid spinster aunt could be found swaying to the piano, humming off key. The wedding breakfast might have been a stiff exercise in etiquette, but what followed was often a riot disguised as civility. Guests let loose in ways that no etiquette manual could salvage. After all, nothing brings out true character like a few glasses of port and an emptying punch bowl. The first cracks usually appeared around the toasts. The speeches had been long, sentimental, and increasingly incoherent. By the time the best man stood up, many guests were deep into their second or fourth glass of bubbly courage. Victorian punch wasn't a gentle mixture of fruit and fizz. It was a high-octane concoction of brandy, sherry, sugar, and denial. It didn't take much before tongues loosened, laughter grew louder, and someone inevitably confused praised the couple with publicly recount their childhood embarrassments. The best man in particular was a wild card. His job was to toast the groom and charm the crowd, but a few too many drinks often turned charm into chaos. "Ah, young Charles," one best man might begin, "a fine fellow, though I do recall when he once serenaded a dairymaid by mistake." The bride's mother would gasp, the groom would glare, and the newspapers the next day would call it a most spirited celebration. As the food cleared, the truly Victorian transformation began, from sanctity to scandal. Guests wandered into drawing rooms for after-dinner conversation that quickly devolved into gossip. Servants, trained to appear invisible, eavesdropped like champions and carried the juiciest tidbits downstairs. "Did you see the bridesmaid who tripped over a train? I heard Lord Pembroke's boutonniere caught fire. They say the groom's uncle fell asleep in the orangery again." By the next morning, these harmless incidents would have grown into moral parables circulating across town. Dancing, when it was permitted, brought its own set of dangers. The waltz, already controversial for its scandalous close hold, was often reserved for the younger guests under strict supervision. But supervision, like sobriety, was fleeting. Soon the music grew livelier, corsets creaked in protest, and someone's elbow inevitably collided with a candelabra. Nothing said "successful wedding" like a minor fire quickly extinguished with punch. In larger houses, the wedding party could spill well into the evening. As the bride changed into her going-away dress, guests lingered, unwilling to surrender the open bar or the gossip opportunities. Men retreated to the smoking room, where cigars and whiskey loosened tongues even further. There they debated everything from politics to the curvature of the bridesmaid's posture, while pretending not to notice that one of their number had fallen asleep in the armchair, snoring through his moustache. Meanwhile, the women gathered in drawing rooms to rest, which mostly meant dissecting the day's events. They discussed the bride's complexion, a little pale but quite sweet, the sermon, long but at least not political, and the cake, impressive, though slightly aggressive to the teeth. Every remark was delivered in tones of exaggerated kindness that barely concealed judgment sharp enough to cut glass. The true post-wedding sport wasn't dancing, it was gossip, scored like fencing, one remark at a time, and of course, not every guest survived the festivities with dignity intact. The combination of tight corsets, poor ventilation, and copious champagne led to what Victorians politely called a fainting spell. At least one lady per wedding was guaranteed to swoon, ideally into the arms of a suitably unmarried gentleman. The fainting couch, that indispensable piece of Victorian furniture, often found itself fully booked. By nightfall, the party's energy shifted again. Carriages began lining up outside as servants hurried through the aftermath, spilled punch, broken glasses, wilted flowers, and a trail of feathers from someone's decorative hat. The newlyweds made their dramatic exit amid cheers and tears, leaving behind an atmosphere equal parts exhaustion and relief. But their departure didn't end the evening. For the remaining guests, it was open season. Freed from the moral presence of the couple, the older guests reminisced about their own weddings, simpler times, fewer medical emergencies, while the younger ones flirted with reckless enthusiasm. Even when the house finally fell silent, the wedding wasn't truly over. The next morning brought the inevitable hangover, both literal and social. Servants whispered about who'd stumbled, who'd spilled wine, and who'd made eyes at the wrong person. Mothers wrote anxious letters of apology for minor indiscretions. Newspapers printed polite summaries that omitted the more colourful details. A joyous event attended by numerous distinguished guests, they'd say, neglecting to mention the cousin who tried to dance with a fern. But beneath the embarrassment, there was something oddly endearing about it all. For one brief chaotic evening, the Victorians dropped their masks of propriety. Between the fainting, flirting, and faintly scandalous stories, they revealed what their etiquette manuals tried so hard to hide, that even the most rigidly moral society couldn't resist a good party. So the wedding day, that glittering performance of virtue, always ended the same way, with laughter, loosened corsets, and a few reputations left wobbling like jelly, and it was proof that beneath all the starch and lace, Victorians were still gloriously, disastrously human. Every good Victorian wedding ended with regret, and someone losing a monocle. The vows might have been solemn, but the hangover was universal. Ah, the Victorian dowry, where romance met accounting, and love was measured in pounds sterling. In theory, a wedding joined two hearts. In practice, it joined one family's money to another family's expectations. The price of love was literal, and for many parents, the only thing scarier than marrying off a daughter was calculating how much it would cost to get rid of her respectably. For richer or poorer, mostly poorer, the dowry, a sum of money or property given to the groom upon marriage, was an ancient custom, but the Victorians perfected it into financial theatre. A girl's worth wasn't defined by her charm, intellect, or laugh, but by how many zeros her father could write before passing out. It was less "will you marry me" and more "let's review your liquidity." For the upper classes, dowries were weapons in the ongoing arms race of respectability. A wealthy merchant might trade thousands of pounds to marry his daughter into the nobility, an alliance of cash for class. Aristocrats, whose family fortunes were often decaying faster than their ancestral wallpaper, eagerly accepted these new money matches to prop up their estates. In essence, it was social alchemy. One family gained prestige, the other bought its way into polite society. Everyone pretended it was love, but it wasn't just the rich who suffered. The middle classes, ever desperate to appear more refined than they were, plunged themselves into ruin trying to imitate upper-class extravagance. Fathers mortgaged homes, sold businesses, and borrowed from relatives to assemble a dowry befitting a lady. Etiquette demanded that a bride bring something, if not land or stocks, then silverware, furnishings, or at least an intimidating number of lace handkerchiefs. One London father reportedly sold his coal business to fund his daughter's marriage into a minor baronet's family, only to discover later that the baronet was mostly decorative and entirely broke. For women, the dowry was both blessing and trap, could secure a good match, but also reduce her to a walking transaction. Suitors evaluated brides with the same enthusiasm used to inspect livestock, politely inquiring about her accomplishments, while mentally tabulating the value of her dowry. No one said it out loud, of course. They couched it in genteel phrases like "a lady of means" or "a most suitable connection." Everyone knew what it meant. She came with a cheque attached, and heaven help the woman without one. A dowryless girl was practically invisible in drawing-room society. Without financial backing, her only hope was miraculous beauty, scandalous charm, or a desperate widower with poor eyesight. Such women were pitied, lectured, and occasionally shipped off to act as companions to elderly aunts. In the brutal arithmetic of Victorian courtship, affection was optional, but assets were not. Even after a match was made, the negotiations were fierce. Marriage settlements, legal contracts outlining what each side contributed, were drawn up with the precision of treaty documents. Lawyers argued over annuities, inheritance clauses, and pin money, a genteel term for the bride's personal allowance. It wasn't uncommon for negotiations to last longer than the engagement itself. If true love could survive the paperwork, it could probably survive anything. But the cruel irony was that dowries rarely guaranteed happiness, only obligation. A bride's family, having paid dearly, expected gratitude. A groom, having purchased stability, often felt entitled. The marriage that began with ledgers too often ended with resentment. Many women discovered, to their horror, that once their dowry was transferred, so was their power. In legal terms, a married woman's wealth immediately became her husband's property. He could spend it, squander it, or gamble it away, and she had no legal recourse beyond fainting strategically. Some husbands viewed their wives' dowries as investment capital for riskier ventures. One unfortunate bride from Liverpool watched her entire dowry vanish when her husband used it to modernise his shipping business, which promptly sank. The bride's family was humiliated, the groom moved to France, and society concluded that she had been unwise in her affections, because in the Victorian world, financial disasters were always women's fault, even when caused by men. Meanwhile, the press reported on the staggering sums exchanged in fashionable marriages, fueling public envy and despair. Lady Margaret's dowry of £50,000 secures her union with the Earl of Grantham, one paper would declare, conveniently omitting that £50,000 was more than most Britons would earn in 10 lifetimes. It was economic voyeurism disguised as celebration. Every engagement announcement a financial transaction thinly veiled in lace. Working-class families, of course, operated in a different currency. Their dowries were modest, a few pieces of furniture, household linens, or a savings account painstakingly built over years. But even there, the same social pressure lingered. A bride who brought nothing to her marriage was whispered about. A bride who brought something, even a good tea set, was praised as sensible. Respectability always came with a price tag. And yet, there were rebels. Some women refused the dowry system altogether. Feminists and radicals in the later Victorian years denounced it as legalised bribery. One suffragist called it the ransom women pay for permission to exist. A few daring couples married for love alone, modestly, scandalously, admirably, but these were exceptions, not norms. Most families still clung to the belief that a large dowry could buy happiness, or at least a respectable address. In the end, the Victorian dowry system was the perfect paradox. A moral society built on financial immorality. It turned affection into negotiation, virtue into value, and marriage into a contract with emotional side effects. Fathers aged prematurely, mothers fretted over embroidery and interest rates, and brides stood radiant at the altar. Radiant, that is, if you ignored the sound of coins clinking beneath their veils. So when the minister intoned those sacred words, for richer or poorer, everyone knew the joke. The richer had already been decided. The poorer came right after the honeymoon. For richer or poorer, mostly poorer. In Victorian England, love might conquer all, but only after your accountant approved the match. There's an old saying that you can tell how much someone loves you by what they give you. If that's true, Victorian newlyweds were adored, extravagantly, impractically, and often regretfully, because while love may have been priceless, the gifts were not. Guests arrived at weddings bearing an avalanche of ornate, glittering and bewildering objects, things that no sane couple would ever need, want, or be able to identify without a guidebook. If you didn't know what it was probably expensive. Gift-giving in Victorian England wasn't about thoughtfulness. It was about performance, an arms race of generosity wrapped in silver and sugness. A wedding gift wasn't meant to please the bride and groom, it was meant to impress the other guests. Each item functioned as a subtle announcement. Observe my taste, my wealth, and my utter disregard for practicality. The upper classes set the tone. Their gifts were breathtakingly ornate and uniformly useless. Silverware was the reigning monarch of wedding presents, not just spoons and forks, but every conceivable variation of utensil that could be invented to serve, lift, poke, or display food. There were silver asparagus tongs, marrow scoops, grape scissors, butter knives shaped like swans, and sugar sifters that resembled miniature torture devices. If there was a food that could be consumed in polite society, someone had designed an implement for it. Then came the toast racks, those shiny skeletal contraptions designed to hold slices of toast vertically, ensuring they cooled rapidly and became inedible in record time. No Victorian breakfast table was complete without one, and no Victorian bride was spared receiving at least 3. A well-to-do household could easily end up with enough toast racks to equip a small hotel. Porcelain was another favourite. Hand-painted vases, figurines, and tea sets adorned with scenes of shepherdesses frolicking among improbable clouds. These delicate treasures were meant for display, not use. To actually drink from them was social heresy. Many couples kept entire cabinets filled with porcelain that no one dared touch, except to dust, a task that generated lifelong resentment among maids and housekeepers. The middle classes, desperate to appear fashionable, copied these habits with budget-friendly substitutes. Instead of sterling silver, they gave electroplated nickel. Instead of porcelain, they offered elaborately glazed pottery. These imitation gifts were often more colourful and far less durable, one careless elbow at the reception, and someone's hard-earned social climbing shattered on the carpet. But the real absurdity came from the sheer redundancy. Because gift registries didn't exist yet, couples received endless variations of the same item. Guests, terrified of choosing something too ordinary, all settled on the same solution. Buy something shiny and foreign-sounding. The result? Newlyweds unwrapped wave after wave of nearly identical silver candlesticks, biscuit barrels, and sugar bowls. One bride reportedly received 14 pickle forks and 2 stuffed peacocks, decorative, not culinary. And these weren't gifts you could easily re-gift or hide. Every present was expected to be displayed prominently in the couple's home, at least for the first year, as proof of their good connections. If a visiting aunt didn't see her butter dish on the mantel, she'd take it as a personal insult and report the snub to the entire social circle. Victorian decor, therefore, wasn't so much designed as forced by obligation. Drawing rooms became museums of unwanted sentiment. Etiquette made the whole ordeal worse. There were rules for everything. How to send gifts, always deliver before the wedding, how to label them, cards in elegant script only, and even how to respond. Couples were expected to write personal thank you notes to every single giver, a monumental task when you'd just been buried under a mountain of silverware. The letters should be modest yet warm, advised the household companion, 1876. One must express delight, even for items of dubious taste. Translation: lie politely about that terrifying porcelain cherub. For the guests, gift-giving was also a social trap. Too cheap and you were branded stingy. Too extravagant and you appeared desperate for approval. Even the choice of material was fraught with symbolism. Iron meant strength but was considered vulgar. Silver meant prosperity but risked being cliché. Ivory was luxurious but drew quiet murmurs about moral decadence. Some guests tried to be original, presenting items like carved paperweights, stuffed birds, or embroidered fire screens depicting alarming pastoral scenes. The phrase, "it's the thought that counts," had clearly not been invented yet. And then there were the eccentric gifts, those that defied logic altogether. There are recorded examples of couples receiving live turtles for longevity, stuffed dogs for loyalty, or entire sets of taxidermied birds posed in romantic tableaus. One overzealous godfather gifted his niece a framed lock of Queen Victoria's hair, which, given the era's obsession with mementos, was considered touching rather than alarming. The working classes, by contrast, gave what they could afford: practical gifts, often handmade, a knitted blanket, a set of linens, or a simple clock. Ironically, these were the items that actually lasted. But Victorian society measured sentimentality by cost, not usefulness. The humble gifts, though beloved, were rarely displayed in the main parlour. They were tucked quietly into pedumes, while the monstrous silver centrepiece, depicting, say, Neptune wrestling a dolphin, took pride of place. For the couple, the aftermath of unwrapping was half joy, half horror. The table was buried under metallic gleam, fragile china, and embossed horrors they couldn't return. The thank you list stretched for pages. The bride smiled bravely through the ordeal, murmuring, "How lovely," while mentally calculating how much storage space a silver egg warmer required. The groom stood nearby, gazing at the mountain of objects that would soon need polishing, thinking wistfully about eloping. And yet, amid all the absurdity, there was something touching about it. Every impractical gift, every pointless trinket, was an artifact of affection, or at least of social pressure disguised as affection. The Victorians loved their ceremonies, and giving gifts was how they proved it, through glitter, excess, and the occasional porcelain nightmare. So the next time you see a Victorian drawing room stuffed with silver swans and ornamental teapots, remember this: they weren't decorating, they were obligated. If you didn't know what it was probably expensive. Victorian wedding gifts weren't about love, they were about survival in a world where even gratitude required polishing. Every modern bridesmaid knows the job comes with its fair share of headaches, ill-fitting dresses, forced smiles, and the occasional emotional hostage situation. But in Victorian England, being a bridesmaid wasn't just inconvenient, it was supernatural warfare. You weren't there to fluff veils or hold bouquets, you were there to act as a decoy for malevolent forces. Congratulations, you're not here for emotional support, you're ghost bait. The tradition of bridesmaids long predates the Victorians, stretching back to ancient Rome, where 10 attendants on each side were required to dress exactly like the bride and groom to confuse evil spirits who might want to curse the couple. The Victorians, never ones to waste a good superstition, revived this custom with gusto and embroidery. In their eyes, The wedding ceremony wasn't just a social contract, but a cosmic event vulnerable to meddling from spirits, jealous ex-lovers, and occasionally the bride's own extended family. Thus, bridesmaids became human shields for fate. Dressed in matching gowns that mimic the bride's, they served as spiritual camouflage, drawing misfortune away from her purity and onto themselves, a cheerful concept if you enjoyed unpaid metaphysical labour. These attendants didn't walk down the aisle to support their friend's big day. They marched into battle with lace gloves and parasols, hoping the forces of darkness mistook them for the main attraction. Of course, as with all Victorian customs, this duty came wrapped in impossible expectations. Bridesmaids had to be young, unmarried, respectable, and preferably attractive enough to look decorative, but not so beautiful as to outshine the bride. Their role was to hover gracefully, smile faintly, and exist as living accessories to her triumph. A wedding wasn't a declaration of love, it was a theatrical production, and the bridesmaids were the ensemble cast who couldn't afford to forget their lines. Choosing bridesmaids was itself a delicate process. Etiquette guides recommended selecting between 4 and 12, depending on the family's wealth and how many matching dresses one could finance without triggering bankruptcy. The more bridesmaids you had, the grander the spectacle, and, symbolically, the more protection against both evil and gossip. A small army of pastel-clad women was a visible sign of status, purity, and spiritual insurance. Their attire was a subject of intense scrutiny. While the bride wore white, or more accurately, anxiety-coloured, the bridesmaids' dresses were pastel shades, pale blues, greens, pinks, and lavenders. Each hue carried meaning: blue for fidelity, green for hope, pink for happiness. The only forbidden colour was scarlet, which suggested either scandal or enthusiasm, both of which were frowned upon at weddings. Their bouquets and bonnets were carefully coordinated to avoid upstaging the bride, and their corsets ensured they couldn't move enough to accidentally do so. Being a bridesmaid was expensive. Unlike modern times, where the bride might gift dresses or jewellery, Victorian bridesmaids paid for their own outfits, and they weren't cheap. Silk, ribbons, gloves, and hats all added up to a small fortune, especially since the dresses were often custom-made and utterly useless for any other occasion. It is considered indelicate to rewear a bridesmaid gown, warned one etiquette book, which was convenient advice for the garment industry and ruinous for everyone else. Beyond their decorative function, bridesmaids had practical and occasionally bizarre duties. They were responsible for arranging the bride's train, ensuring she didn't trip over it on her way to matrimony. They distributed rose petals or myrtle leaves, guarded the bride's gloves and bouquet, and sometimes accompanied her on pre-wedding errands, acting as buffers against unwanted suitors or curious relatives. On the big day, they stood by like statues during the ceremony, enduring sermons about chastity with smiles that said, "Please hurry, my corset has entered another dimension." Then came the ribbons. A favourite Victorian custom was for bridesmaids to tie ribbons from the bride's bouquet and hand them to guests as keepsakes. Each ribbon symbolised a blessing, or in some cases, a veiled warning. Single women fought over these like they contained actual luck, believing they increased their chances of future marriage. One poor bridesmaid in Bath was nearly knocked into a table of jellies when two spinsters lunged simultaneously for the love and fidelity ribbon. The bridesmaids' duties didn't end after the vows either. They were expected to manage the social choreography of the reception, keeping unruly guests in check, fetching fainting salts, and ensuring the bride didn't accidentally converse with anyone scandalous. At the wedding breakfast, they acted as conversational lubricants, filling awkward silences and deflecting intrusive questions like, "So when will you be married, dear?" They were also expected to dance with less desirable guests, elderly widowers, second cousins, and anyone who smelled faintly of mothballs and regret. As for rewards, none. The best they could hope for was the traditional bridesmaid's gift, usually a handkerchief, brooch, or locket, a token of appreciation that didn't even begin to cover the financial or emotional damages. One satirical magazine in 1878 quipped, "To be a bridesmaid is to purchase one's own uniform, attend one's own exhaustion, and receive as compensation a trinket worth less than the gloves worn to collect it. But the job had its hidden perks. Being a bridesmaid was a strategic social opportunity. Weddings were one of the few occasions where single men and women could mingle semi-legally under the supervision of alcohol and flowers. Many engagements began at someone else's ceremony, the ultimate recycling of romance. Thus, even as bridesmaids smiled dutifully beside the bride, they kept one eye on the guest list and another on the seating chart. Still, behind the smiles and lace was fatigue. Bridesmaids' memoirs from the period reveal that most found the role more punishing than pleasant. Between standing motionless for hours, enduring endless speeches, and pretending to enjoy cold aspic, it was less maid of honour and more hostage of honour. Yet in true Victorian fashion, the ordeal was rebranded as virtue. Suffering gracefully was the mark of good breeding, and bridesmaids, after all, were practising for marriage, another institution based largely on endurance and decorative obedience. So the next time you see a faded Victorian photograph of a bride flanked by her identically dressed attendants, remember that those women weren't just there for symmetry. They were fulfilling their sacred duty to distract ghosts, absorb misfortune, and look faintly radiant while doing it. Congratulations, you're not here for emotional support or your ghost bait. Victorian bridesmaids didn't fight over bouquets, they fought off bad luck, heatstroke, and the occasional demonic misunderstanding. For all their talk of bliss and matrimonial harmony, the Victorians somehow managed to make even honeymoons exhausting. Today, newlyweds imagine sandy beaches and privacy. A Victorian couple imagined carriages, chaperones, and indigestion. Their honeymoon wasn't a reward for surviving the wedding. It was the final exam in endurance, etiquette, and emotional awkwardness. Nothing says romance like bringing your mother-in-law on your honeymoon. The very idea of a honeymoon was relatively new in the 19th century. Before then, couples simply went home and got on with the business of being married and judged. But as the middle classes rose and leisure travel became fashionable, a new ritual emerged, the post-wedding journey. It was supposed to be a private escape, yet privacy was precisely what Victorians feared most. Moralists warned that unaccompanied travel may inflame passion, which, given the point of a honeymoon, was either deeply ironic or perfectly Victorian. Thus, chaperones came along. Sometimes it was a trusted aunt, sometimes a sister, and sometimes, most nightmarishly, the bride's own mother. She was there for propriety, which really meant to make sure nothing unseemly occurs until it's been properly scheduled. Imagine the scene, a nervous couple in the back of a carriage, hands folded, while mother dozes in the corner, the one eye open. Nothing kills youthful ardour faster than the sound of a matron clearing her throat. Destinations, too, were dictated by social convention rather than desire. Seaside resorts like Brighton or Weymouth were popular among the respectable classes, offering fresh air, promenades, and other people's scrutiny. The wealthy preferred the continent, Paris if you wanted elegance, Switzerland if you wanted mountains, and Italy if you wanted scandal. But travel was no easy adventure. Railways were still unpredictable, roads bumpy, and hotels ranged from adequate to hygienically medieval. Couples often spent their first week of married life arguing with innkeepers about towels. The journey itself could be an ordeal. Victorian carriages had all the comfort of a coffin on wheels, and early trains rattled so violently that letters home described them as shaking the very vows from one's body. Motion sickness was a frequent guest. So were breakdowns, missed connections, and the occasional encounter with thieves. Travel guides chirpily advised brides to carry smelling salts, a small pistol, and a calm demeanour under distress. None of these helped when your husband fainted at the Channel crossing. And then there was the question everyone didn't talk about, the wedding night. Victorian etiquette treated the topic of intimacy with the same enthusiasm it reserved for contagious diseases. Most brides were sent into marriage with little more than vague metaphors and a prayer. Advice books recommended that a new wife submit cheerfully to her husband's affections, as though marriage were a mild dental procedure. Some mothers provided cryptic wisdom, be still and think of your future home, which was about as helpful as a warning label on a candle. For grooms, the honeymoon could be equally stressful. The pressure to perform, to be both romantic and respectable, often collided with years of repressed upbringing. Many new husbands arrived at their destination only to spend the first night anxiously reading hints for young husbands while their wives pretended to be asleep. Victorian romance, for all its poetry, was frequently accompanied by the sound of two people wondering whether they were doing it wrong. And while the newlyweds navigated the minefield of intimacy, they were also expected to write letters. A proper couple sent daily updates to family announcing their safe arrival and continued felicity. Translation: we're alive and no one's fainted yet. These letters were often read aloud over breakfast back home, ensuring that even from afar the couple's private life remained community property. By the late 1800s, the honeymoon had turned into a full-blown social performance. Illustrated magazines printed travel accounts from famous couples, complete with sketches of the Alps or Venetian gondolas. The middle classes, desperate to imitate, followed suit. Some newlyweds posed for departure photographs, standing beside luggage piles as large as small fortresses. Servants waved them off while silently calculating how long before the inevitable postcard arrived saying, "We missed the cook." Not every honeymoon went smoothly. There were reports of brides catching pneumonia in drafty inns, of carriages overturning, of grooms accidentally booking separate rooms for modesty and then realising their mistake too late. One diary entry from 1872 records a couple spending their first night not in a romantic hotel but in a customs office in Calais, arguing with inspectors over the husband's imported cigars. "A trial of patience," she wrote, "but perhaps a fitting beginning." For the less affluent, the honeymoon was shorter and closer to home, a day trip to the seaside or a rented cottage. Working-class couples sometimes took the train to a nearby fairground or picnic spot before returning the same evening. It may not have been luxurious, but at least there were no chaperones, and the expectations were refreshingly realistic. Eat something, laugh a little, and avoid scandal. Still, even the simplest honeymoon carried social weight. It was the proof of respectability, the visible continuation of the wedding spectacle. Returning home without one invited whispers, perhaps they couldn't afford it, or worse, they preferred each other's company too much. So the Victorian honeymoon, rather than being an escape from society, was society's encore performance, a travelling stage play of romance, restraint, and logistical misery. Behind the polite postcards and pressed flowers was a truth few admitted, that marriage began not with candlelight and passion, but with shared fatigue, misplaced luggage, and the faint snore of a relative in the next room. Nothing says romance like bringing your mother-in-law on your honeymoon. In the Victorian era, love didn't sweep you off your feet. It packed your bags, summoned a chaperone, and booked you second-class passage to discomfort. Few experiences in Victorian life were more mythologized, moralized, and thoroughly misunderstood than the wedding night. For a society that could write multi-volume treatises on the moral dangers of ankles, the idea of conjugal intimacy was an existential crisis wrapped in lace. After the cake, the carriage, and the chaperones came the great mystery, the event every bride was told to anticipate, dread, or pretend didn't exist. Victorian intimacy guides were like IKEA manuals, confusing, judgmental, and full of missing parts. To understand the chaos, one must first appreciate the sheer vacuum of knowledge in which Victorian couples entered marriage. Sex education did not exist. The average young woman learned about reproduction through whispered warnings, vague metaphors, or the occasional horrifying euphemism, "your husband's conjugal attentions." Mothers might offer advice, but it was less instruction and more cryptic poetry. A typical pre-wedding talk might go, "Be obedient, be calm, and think of your future duties." Translation: good luck figuring it out. For men, the situation wasn't much better. Most were told that women were delicate creatures incapable of physical desire, passionless angels, according to one popular manual, and that treating them as anything less than sacred was barbaric. unfortunately no one explained how to reconcile this with the biological reality of marriage. The result was generations of bewildered husbands approaching intimacy with the emotional energy of a man disarming a bomb. The real instruction came from marriage guides, a booming literary industry catering to newlyweds too embarrassed to ask real questions. Titles like The Wedding Night, What a Young Couple Should Know, or The Bride's Book of Knowledge promised enlightenment but delivered confusion. Most mixed half-baked anatomy with long sermons about morality and restraint. A particularly famous example, The Duties of Married Life, 1856, assured readers that mutual affection, when properly directed, leads to wholesome union. What properly directed meant was anyone's guess. Another bestseller, Advice to Young Wives, warned that a lady should never encourage her husband's baser instincts, for passion ungoverned is a beast. In other words, marriage was supposed to unite two souls while carefully avoiding the bodies attached to them. These books also reinforced the belief that a woman's virtue was fragile, something that could be ruined even within marriage if the husband was too enthusiastic. As one author gravely cautioned, excess in the marital chamber may disturb the wife's delicate nerves. Women were instructed to submit quietly, avoid appearing interested, and maintain composure at all costs. Husbands were advised to proceed gently, ideally with dim lighting, modest language, and the permission of heaven. It wasn't just prudishness, it was fear. Victorian medicine linked nearly every ailment in women to nervous strain and hysteria, often attributed to sexual activity. Doctors warned that too much conjugal contact could lead to insanity, infertility, or a loss of moral fibre. One medical guide even claimed that overindulgence in the nuptial act might cause men to lose their hair and women to lose their souls. It's hard to feel romantic when your instruction manual sounds like a death threat. Even within respectable households, the subject was shrouded in secrecy. Beds were separate, or at least divided by an ocean of lace and propriety. Newlyweds often spent the first night simply talking, and so cautiously circling the subject, and who was supposed to start the inevitable. Diaries from the period are filled with veiled references. Retired early, spoke long of love, or the ominous, a difficult evening but peace restored. These genteel phrases covered everything from awkward conversation to full-scale panic. The morning after brought its own anxieties. Victorian society expected brides to radiate chastity even after marriage. Too cheerful, and she risks seeming indecent. Too glum, and people assumed her husband was a brute. The ideal post-wedding demeanour was serenely contented with mild fatigue. Servants whispered about whether the bride looked different, and mothers eagerly awaited coded letters from honeymooning daughters. The journey has been enlightening was a favourite euphemism for, we finally figured it out. And of course there were moral reformers who tried to regulate even this private realm. The purity movement preached abstinence within marriage except for procreation, which turned the honeymoon into a kind of bureaucratic procedure. Some manuals suggested that couples refrain from intimacy for the first few days to strengthen moral resolve. Others warned husbands that marital affection must be tempered by prayer. It was less happily ever after, and more administratively sanctioned affection. Working-class couples, blessedly, faced fewer illusions. Without the luxury of lace and moral treatises, they entered marriage with a much more pragmatic understanding of life. But even they weren't immune to the moral contagion of the age. Church sermons and penny pamphlets filtered down the same message. Virtue was fragile, and women's worth depended on keeping it. As the century went on, a few brave voices began to challenge the madness. Doctors like William Acton and reformers like Annie Besant argued for sexual education and mutual pleasure. Acton, despite his reputation for prudishness, shocked his peers by admitting that women were capable of enjoyment, a statement so radical it was nearly heretical. By the 1890s, progressive thinkers were whispering that perhaps marriage could involve affection, conversation, and physical happiness, though preferably not all at once. Still, for most Victorians, the wedding night remained an ordeal, cloaked in reverence and embarrassment. What should have been a celebration of closeness was turned into a moral obstacle course. The morning after, couples often found themselves sitting awkwardly at breakfast, sipping tea, avoiding eye contact, and pretending to read the newspaper while silently processing the revelation that wedded bliss came with an instruction manual written by people who'd clearly never opened the box. So when you look at those stiff wedding portraits, the bride pale and the groom looking faintly traumatized, remember that the hardest part of their wedding day wasn't the corset or the cake. It was navigating the great Victorian mystery, how to love passionately without ever admitting it. Victorian intimacy guides were like IKEA manuals, confusing, judgmental, and full of missing parts. The only thing less clear than their instructions was whether anyone actually followed them. After the last guest stumbled home, the champagne went flat, and the groom finally stopped searching for his missing cravat. One relic remained from every Victorian wedding, the dress. Not just a garment, a relic of purity, a trophy of status, and an unspoken hostage to sentiment. Once worn, it became less an outfit than a shrine. The wedding might have lasted a single day, but the dress demanded eternal devotion, till death do us part, or until mildew wins. Queen Victoria had once again set the gold standard of obsession. Her 1840 white silk gown, trimmed with Honiton lace, instantly redefined what a wedding dress meant. Before her, brides wore their best gowns, blue, gold, even patterned, something they could re-wear later. But Victoria's white dress, captured in endless engravings, was elevated to sacred artifact. Her admirers treated it as if she had been married not just to Prince Albert, but to laundry science. And thus began the Victorian cult of wedding dress preservation. The day after the ceremony, when the bride was still recovering from emotional dehydration and a possible fainting spell, her dress was whisked away like a royal hostage. The goal was to preserve it forever, or at least long enough for future generations to admire and whisper, "She must have been so pure." This involved a multi-step ritual, equal parts art, chemistry, and madness. First came the cleaning, a delicate procedure that required courage and prayer. The dress had likely suffered during the festivities. Cake crumbs, candle wax, carriage soot, possibly the tears of over-emotional aunts. Removing these stains was a feat performed by specialised laundresses armed with chalk, milk, and substances that could probably dissolve wallpaper. The most dreaded enemy was the iron scorch. One slip and 1,000 pounds of silk turned into a smudge of heartbreak. Then came the starching and pressing. The corset sections had to retain shape, the lace had to stay crisp, and the satin folds had to gleam like sanctified armour. It was less preservation than resurrection. Afterward, the dress was carefully folded in layers of tissue, sprinkled with lavender, and placed in a wooden chest or under a glass dome. Yes, some families literally displayed their wedding gowns in parlours like holy relics. Visitors might be ushered past the cabinet to admire dear mother's dress, as if paying respects at a museum of chastity. For wealthier brides, the preservation process was entrusted to professionals. Entire businesses specialised in cleaning, boxing, and archiving wedding attire, boasting scientific methods of storage, meaning they charged triple to wrap your lace in paper. Catalogues promised the dress would retain its freshness for years to come, which was optimistic in an age when wallpaper contained arsenic and closets bred moths like armies. Middle-class brides, determined to imitate such grandeur, preserved their dresses too, often at ruinous cost. It wasn't just sentiment, it was social proof. To display one's wedding gown in pristine condition was to announce, "We married properly, we could afford waste." The sadder reality was that many could not. Some brides sold their gowns discreetly, explaining to nosy neighbours that it did not suit preservation. Others dyed them darker shades to wear again, a common practical habit before white dresses became synonymous with moral virtue. A pale pink dress might reappear at a ball. A white satin gown could be turned dove grey for formal dinners or morning light. But the social police took note. Re-wearing one's wedding dress was considered unladylike, even desperate. A wedding gown must never be seen again in its original form, advised the Ladies' Gazette in 1871, lest the sacred be rendered common. Translation, enjoy your dress once, then exile it forever. And so wardrobes filled with ghostly white fabrics, tangible memories of joy, now too sacred to touch. Servants dreaded these heirlooms. They were tasked with checking the dress every few months to ensure freshness, a polite euphemism for hunting mould moths and the occasional mouse nesting in satin folds. Some gowns survived decades, others decayed quietly. One tragic letter from 1889 tells of a woman opening her wedding chest only to find her lace eaten to lace-like memory. She concluded poetically, "I suppose time must eat beauty as surely as moths do." For sentimental brides, preservation wasn't enough. Display was everything. Some had their veils or gloves framed under glass, often alongside dried bouquets and miniature portraits. The effect was somewhere between romantic and funerary. Parlour walls became shrines to the day, as if marriage itself had perished immediately afterward. Victorian sentimentality didn't just cling to memory, it embalmed it. Of course, not everyone could afford such sentiment. Working-class women often had one good dress that served for wedding, Sunday service, and eventually funeral. Many wore sturdy cotton or wool gowns, practical enough for later use. These were preserved only in photographs. Stiff, serious portraits showing brides who couldn't imagine storing their clothes when there were mouths to feed. Ironically, those pragmatic choices meant their dresses lived on in daily life, while upper-class silks rotted in boxes. And yet, for all its absurdity, the obsession revealed something tender beneath the starch. In a society that offered women few keepsakes of independence, the wedding dress was theirs alone, a physical embodiment of one moment where they stood, however briefly, at the centre of the world. Keeping it was a quiet rebellion against transience, a way of saying this mattered. Even if the husband turned out disappointing, the lace remained loyal, but time, mildew, and realism always won. By the early 20th century, fashion had shifted, and the Victorian gown, once a proud relic, became an antique curiosity. Daughters inherited them, sighed at the impossible waistlines, and quietly donated them to charity or costume shops. The dresses that survived did so not because of their silk or stitching, but because of the sheer will of memory and the airtight cedar chest. So when you see a Victorian gown today, yellowed but intact, imagine the generations that fussed over it. The brides who wore it, the maids who aired it, the families who spoke of it in reverent tones. It's not just a dress, it's a century's worth of romantic delusion preserved in fabric and lavender. Till death do us part, or until mildew wins. In the Victorian home, the marriage might have soured, but the dress was forever. For Victorians, marriage wasn't merely a personal milestone, it was a professional strategy. Forget modern ideas of romance and compatibility. Love was optional. Climbing the class ladder was mandatory. A wedding wasn't just two people joining hands. It was two families locking horns in a delicate negotiation over money, manners, and moral appearances. In short, matrimony was the most fashionable form of social mobility, and the most perilous. In an age obsessed with hierarchy, marriage was the only ladder many could legally climb without scandal. Birth was destiny, unless, of course, you could marry above your station. For the ambitious middle class, newly rich from factories, railroads, and questionable colonial ventures, the dream was simple. Trade cash for class. A dowry here, a title there, and suddenly your daughter was dining with dukes instead of shopkeepers. The Victorians turned this exchange into an art form so refined it made stock trading look subtle. The upper classes, meanwhile, were only too happy to participate, cautiously. Aristocratic families, weighed down by crumbling estates and inherited debt, viewed wealthy merchants as walking life preservers. They may have smelled faintly of industry and vulgarity, but their bank accounts could resurrect ancestral manners. A title but impoverished bachelor was practically a brand name. a status symbol to which ambitious parents attached their daughters like stock certificates. In return, the gentry lent their noble surnames to families who could finally afford better cutlery. Newspapers loved these alliances. The Illustrated London News and the Morning Post routinely announced marriages that sounded more like corporate mergers. The Honourable Lord Ashcombe to wed Miss Henrietta L. Bristow, heiress of the Midlands textile fortune. Everyone understood what it meant. The family gained legitimacy, the lord gained solvency. Society called it a perfect match. Cynics called it a successful acquisition. But not every climb went smoothly. The line between marrying up and marrying disastrously was thin and slippery. Those who aimed too high often found the view less romantic than anticipated. Aristocrats might accept a rich bride's money, but rarely her manners. Cash can buy an estate, sniffed one duchess, but it cannot buy breeding. In practice, this meant new brides endured years of subtle exile, corrected on their speech, mocked for their enthusiasm, and occasionally forgotten from guest lists until they learned the proper way to criticise servants. Middle-class mothers were the true tacticians of this battlefield. Armed with etiquette manuals and binoculars for spotting unmarried viscounts, they orchestrated introductions at garden parties, charity balls and afternoon teas. Their daughters were coached in the essential arts of social espionage, graceful curtsies, strategic feinting, and conversational restraint. Never mention work, politics, or digestion. Mothers were the original matchmaking managers, the Regency equivalent of LinkedIn recruiters, except with lace gloves and ulterior motives. For men, the pressure was equally absurd. A gentleman might be expected to marry well, but not too well. Heaven forbid he looked like a fortune hunter. Yet, behind closed doors, every bachelor's prospects were evaluated like horse pedigrees. A bride with a £10,000 dowry was ideal. One with 50,000 could ruin your reputation for taste. The delicate balance between greed and gentility was the tightrope every ambitious man walked. Even clergy and intellectuals joined the fray. Vicars sought well-to-do parishioners' daughters. Professors angled for students from wealthy families. For them, a prosperous marriage could mean new endowments or better parish roofs. The morality of the union mattered less than the quality of the upholstery it might afford. And then there were the social disasters, those who married down. A nobleman who wed a governess or an actress risked permanent ostracism. The Victorians had an entire vocabulary for this tragedy. A mésalliance, a romantic imprudence, a fall from station. Newspapers reported such unions with the same tone used for shipwrecks. Families disowned sons for marrying beneath them, while daughters who defied matchmaking expectations were quietly erased from family records and, in some cases, politely declared deceased to society. For women, of course, the stakes were existential. A good marriage could elevate her family for generations, a bad one could sink her without mercy. The cruel irony was that even successful social climbers rarely found freedom. A merchant's daughter might win her title, but she lost her autonomy in the process. Her fortune became her husband's, her voice an accessory. In marrying up, she often discovered she'd simply traded one form of servitude for another, now gilded and approved by the times. Working-class marriage had its own hierarchy, smaller scale but equally strategic. A maid might aim to wed a butler or a coachman, a seamstress, a tradesman. For them, climbing meant escaping dependence, not courting nobility. Their marriages were rooted in survival, not spectacle, yet even they mimicked the etiquette of their betters when they could, staging modest ceremonies and saving for portraits that looked suitably respectable. Every wedding, whether grand or humble, carried this undercurrent of ambition. Behind the flowers and hymns was an invisible exchange rate, virtue for visibility, dowry for dignity, affection for advancement. The Victorians may have worshipped love in poetry, but in practice it was the ladder that mattered. A successful match wasn't about happiness, it was about trajectory. The few who married purely for affection were treated as curiosities. Newspapers described such unions with disbelief, as though documenting rare wildlife. Mr. Frederick Langley of moderate means has taken as wife Miss Clara Wood against the counsel of family and friends. Translation. He married for love, how embarrassing. And yet, there was something strangely theatrical about it all, a societal masquerade where everyone knew the rules but pretended they didn't. Marriage was the stage, money the script, and love the optional improvisation. The most skilled performers rose high, the unlucky fell with flair. By the end of the century, even as romantic ideals softened, the truth remained. Victorian society didn't marry for chemistry, it married for chemistry stocks. Love could wait until after the contracts were signed and the portraits painted. Love was optional, climbing the class ladder was mandatory. In the Victorian marriage market, Cupid didn't carry arrows, he carried a ledger. While the wealthy Victorians were busy fainting in lace and drowning in silverware, the working classes were getting married too, just without the champagne chandeliers and faintly judgmental bishops. Their weddings lacked silk and scandal, but at least no one fainted from corsets or boredom. What the poor lacked in spectacle, they made up for in sincerity. And in a world where love was often rationed alongside wages, their ceremonies managed to be short, affordable, and, against all odds, human. For most working-class couples, marriage wasn't a production, it was a necessity. The goal wasn't to impress society, it was to form a household. They didn't have time for 20-course wedding breakfasts or imported French lace. They had jobs to return to on Monday and a landlord to appease. Weddings happened on days off, usually Saturdays, and lasted about as long as it took to exchange vows and make it to the pub before closing time. Unlike the upper crust, who married in grand churches filled with floral architecture, working people often tied the knot in the modest parish chapels, registry offices, or occasionally even back rooms of local inns. A parson's blessing was ideal, but not always necessary. The real proof of marriage was the community's acknowledgement. You didn't need a string quartet when you had a neighbour with a concertina. The dress code was practical. Brides wore their best, not necessarily white, but clean, respectable, and sturdy enough to wear again. A blue or brown wool gown was common, often handmade or borrowed. Veils were optional, but flowers were essential. Even the poorest bride tried to pin a sprig of myrtle, ivy, or orange blossom. Somewhere, if only to imitate the Queen's fashion. The symbolism of purity mattered less than the fact that it was affordable and smelled better than the coal smoke outside. For the groom, a decent coat and polished boots were the height of elegance. Some rented a top hat for the day, which they would proudly return the next morning, slightly dented but with their dignity intact. The idea of coordinated bridesmaids or decorative carriages was laughable, though if a friend owned a cart it might be decorated with ribbons and called a coach for the afternoon. The ceremony itself was brisk, straightforward, and blissfully lacking in sermonising. The vicar might offer a few solemn words, but he knew better than to test his congregation's patience. Unlike aristocratic weddings, which felt like theatrical marathons, working-class nuptials were efficient affairs. Vows spoken, signatures signed, done. If anyone fainted, it was from nerves, not tight lacing. Afterward came the real celebration, the wedding tea, or for those feeling bold, the wedding supper. These were often held in the family home, a rented hall, or the local pub. Guests crowded around tables covered with simple fare, bread, cold meats, cheese, and enough ale to keep spirits high and memories blurry. There were no seating charts, no delicate silver utensils, and no danger of mistaking one's wine glass for a finger bowl. Everyone ate what was there, sang what they knew, and danced where they could stand. Music was rarely absent. Someone's uncle always played the fiddle, someone's cousin knew a bawdy song or two, and someone's child inevitably fell asleep under the table while adults clapped in rhythm. The laughter was louder than the etiquette police would allow, and the happiness, though rough-edged, was real. A Victorian observer once sniffed that working-class weddings are noisy, unrefined, and full of life. The last part at least was true. Of course, not everyone approved. Moral reformers complained that poor couples treated marriage too lightly, drinking too much or spending beyond their means. The labourer, one social commentator warned, should not waste his wages on festivity, but for many, it was the only celebration they'd ever have. A single day of joy was worth a week of thrift. And unlike their wealthy counterparts, the poor didn't marry for social climbing or dowries. They married for partnership, companionship, and survival. Sometimes those partnerships were pragmatic rather than romantic. A man might marry a widow who could run a household. A woman might marry a fellow worker for security. But even in practicality, there was tenderness, a sense of solidarity in hardship. Genuine love matches too, stories of couples who had met at factories, markets, or church picnics and saved pennies for years to afford a modest ceremony. No orchestra, no imported champagne, and just two people saying, "I do," and meaning it. The honeymoon, if it existed, was brief. A day trip to the seaside or a few nights at a relative's cottage were luxuries. Most newlyweds returned straight to work, side by side in mills or workshops, wearing their rings proudly, visible proof that love, however humble, still had a place between long shifts and short pay. There was also a powerful sense of community ownership in these weddings. Neighbours contributed food, flowers, or even clothing. Children peeked through the church windows, cheering when the couple emerged. It wasn't about prestige, it was about belonging. When a working-class couple married, the whole street celebrated, because their happiness, however brief, was everyone's victory. In photographs, these weddings look stark compared to the polished portraits of the elite. No lace veils, no chandeliers, just grinning faces and badly combed hair. Yet behind those smiles was something the highborn could rarely buy: authenticity. No one was pretending to be anyone else. No one worried about which cousin sat next to whom. No one hired a calligrapher to write invitations in morally superior ink. If Victorian high society turned marriage into a performance, the working class turned it back into what it had been all along, a pact between two people trying to make life a little less lonely. Their weddings lacked silk and scandal, but at least no one fainted from corsets or boredom. While the upper class married for display, the working class married for something rarer in Victorian Britain: genuine affection. If the Victorian wedding was a stage, then scandal was the encore everyone secretly waited for. Behind the respectable facade of lace, vows, and hand-painted invitations lurked a nation obsessed with romantic catastrophe. Runaway brides, fraudulent fiancés, forged titles, and the occasional bigamy trial. These were the stories that truly made Britain's heart flutter. When love failed, there was always the thrill of public humiliation. For a society that claimed to worship morality, Victorians had an insatiable appetite for gossip. Every broken engagement or hasty elopement was a social earthquake, rippling through drawing rooms faster than telegrams. Newspapers loved it. The Illustrated Police News, The Times, and countless penny weeklies turned real people's romantic implosions into serialized dramas. Headlines like "Viscount vanishes with governess" or "Heiress escapes from wedding coach" sold better than sermons and provided infinitely more entertainment. Take the infamous case of the runaway bride of Bath, Miss Amelia Norris, 1863. The daughter of a prosperous banker, she fled her own wedding mere hours before the ceremony, leaving behind a note that read only, "He smells of mothballs." The groom, heartbroken but heavily perfumed, sued her father for breach of promise, claiming emotional and financial damages. Victorian law, ever pragmatic, allowed jilted lovers to sue their exes for failing to marry them, because nothing says true affection like litigation. Indeed, the breach of promise lawsuit was one of the era's favourite scandals, part soap opera, part financial gamble. A woman could drag her ex-fiancé into court for abandoning the engagement, and if she played her cards right, walk away with compensation and public sympathy. It was both a weapon and a warning. The court records are filled with gloriously absurd testimonies. Men claiming they'd been led astray by flirtation, women producing bundles of love letters as evidence, and judges struggling to maintain composure while listening to poetry read aloud as proof of seduction. But the real showstoppers were the elopements, the adrenaline-fueled acts of rebellion that set polite society clutching its pearls. Gretna Green, a tiny Scottish village just over the English border, became famous as the ultimate destination for couples fleeing parental authority. Scotland's marriage laws were wonderfully lax. Two people could wed on the spot simply by declaring themselves husband and wife before witnesses. It became the Las Vegas of the 19th century, minus the sequins and with far worse weather. Carriages thundered north at all hours, chased by furious fathers and equally furious dowagers. Blacksmiths in Gretna Green built entire careers out of forging marriages, literally and figuratively, and by striking an anvil as part of the ceremony. Anvil priests, as they were known, claimed to have married thousands. Each clang was another blow against convention. Romantic, perhaps, legal, occasionally, not all elopements ended happily. Many resulted in social ruin, particularly for women. A runaway bride who returned without a husband was effectively excommunicated from respectable life. Her family might quietly send her abroad, a euphemism for exile. One tragic case in 1871 involved a young woman who eloped with a man claiming to be an army captain, only to discover he was, in fact, a travelling umbrella salesman with a wife in Liverpool. The newspapers dubbed him the parasol polygamist, which at least gave history a laugh. Then there were the engagement frauds, the darker side of Victorian courtship. The rigid obsession with appearances created an entire underworld of imposters. Fake aristocrats, counterfeit heirs, and self-proclaimed barons of mysterious foreign estates haunted London's ballrooms. Charming heiresses out of dowries and jewels. One notorious swindler, styling himself Count de l'Orléans, wooed 3 different women simultaneously, vanishing before each wedding with their family's money and occasionally their maid. By the time he was caught, he had racked up enough engagements to fill a small parish registry. The upper classes treated these scandals with both horror and delight. Drawing rooms buzzed with speculation. Did you hear? Lady Morton's niece was seen alone in a phaeton with her tutor. Scandalous! Was it before or after the banns were read? The details mattered less than the performance of outrage. It wasn't truly Victorian unless someone fainted dramatically over tea. The working press amplified it all, feeding the public's morbid curiosity. Papers printed caricatures of disgraced couples, complete with invented dialogue. Songs and stage plays followed, tragicomedies about jilted lovers, unfaithful husbands, and brides fleeing in their petticoats. Even Queen Victoria's family couldn't escape the gossip mill. When her son, the future Edward VII, was caught in a youthful indiscretion, the press handled it with the same delicate restraint as a brass band falling down the stairs. Of course, not every scandal was sinister. Some were downright comical. One Yorkshire wedding was abruptly cancelled when the groom's mother fainted at the altar, not from emotion, but from discovering the bride was her former housemaid. In another case, a bride's veil caught fire from a candle mid-ceremony, prompting a stampede that ended in the vicar's temporary retirement. The papers called it a wedding ablaze, metaphorically and otherwise. Still, the fascination with broken engagements and runaway marriages revealed something deeply human beneath all the lace and moralising. The Victorians were terrified of emotion, yet endlessly drawn to it. They worshipped decorum but couldn't resist disaster. In a society obsessed with order, scandal was the only form of honest expression left. And so the cycle continued. Engagements announced in flowery print, vows made in trembling sincerity, and, inevitably, 1 or 2 carriage escapes before the ink was dry. Because even in an age of strict etiquette and iron corsets, the heart occasionally refused to behave, and when it didn't, the Victorians made sure to buy tickets to the show. When love failed, there was always the thrill of public humiliation. In the Victorian era, romance might have been a gamble, but scandal was always a sure bet. The Victorians may be long gone, their corsets retired, their cakes fossilised, their etiquette books gathering dust, but their ghosts still haunt the modern wedding aisle. Every time someone debates centrepiece colours, maxes out a credit card for a single day, or nervously wonders whether Aunt Susan will start a scene at the reception, a Victorian somewhere is smiling smugly. Because they invented wedding stress. We just added Wi-Fi and hashtags. It's tempting to think of the Victorian wedding as a charming antique, a relic of lace, candles, and formality, but its influence runs much deeper. The entire concept of the wedding as a high-stakes public performance originates with them. Before the 19th century, marriage was a practical affair, quick vows, modest meal, maybe a blessing if you were lucky. The Victorians turned it into the event of a lifetime. Every flower, photograph, and tear-stained speech today owes its DNA to their obsession with appearances. They were the first to industrialize romance. The explosion of consumer goods in the mid-1800s transformed weddings from private unions into commercial spectacles. Suddenly, everything needed to be purchased. Dresses, jewelry, invitations, photography, carriages, cakes. Sound familiar? What began as a tasteful display of refinement became an arms race of opulence. Even middle-class families felt the pressure to keep up, terrified of appearing common. Today, the only difference is that instead of neighbours judging your guest list, it's the internet. The Victorians also perfected the idea of performative purity, the notion that the wedding day must embody moral, social, and aesthetic perfection. A bride had to look angelic, the venue divine, and the couple utterly flawless. Anything less was a moral failing. That relentless pursuit of ideal love set the tone for the next 2 centuries. Modern brides may not faint in corsets, but they'll gladly panic over matching linens and the exact hue of ivory versus eggshell, same stress, fewer petticoats. And while today's couples might scoff at Victorian formality, they've merely swapped it for digital decorum. In the 19th century, etiquette dictated who you could invite and where they should sit. In the 21st, it dictates your Instagram captions. You must post at least one tasteful pre-ceremony shot, says the modern gospel, but never more than 3 photos of the cake. Victorian brides worried about uninvited aunts. Modern ones worry about unflattering tags. Then there's the money. Victorian families routinely bankrupted themselves to appear respectable. Dowries, floral arches, silverware, entire orchestras hired for one afternoon. That same spirit thrives in today's $40 billion wedding industry. The difference is that now, instead of your parents' inheritance, it's your credit score on the altar. For richer or poorer has never sounded more prophetic. Even the idea of the perfect photograph comes straight from Victorian anxiety. They were the first generation to see their weddings captured on camera, and thus the first to panic about how they looked doing it. Those stiff, unblinking portraits set a precedent. The belief that a wedding isn't real unless it's documented. Modern couples might not have to stand still for 6 minutes, but they'll still spend half the day posing for photos that look spontaneous. And let's not forget the obsession with symbolism. Victorians believed every object carried moral weight. Flowers represented purity, lace represented virtue, even the shape of the cake whispered something about prosperity. Fast forward to today's Pinterest boards, where every candle and font choice is an emblem of personal identity. We may not believe a marigold foretells jealousy anymore, but we still panic if the colour scheme clashes with the mood board. Their influence extends even to our emotional expectations. The Victorians sold marriage as the pinnacle of happiness, the crowning glory of a woman's life. That sentimental marketing campaign never ended. Modern weddings, despite all our supposed progress, still carry the weight of fantasy. Every movie, ad, and reality show whispers the same message, that a perfect wedding equals a perfect life. The Victorians didn't just invent the white dress, they invented the pressure to deserve it. And like their ancestors, today's couples are still negotiating between love and image. The Victorians married for class, reputation, and survival. We marry for love, but still stage it for approval. The technology has changed, the audience hasn't. The Victorian wedding guest sat in the pews, squinting to judge your lace quality. The modern guest scrolls through your feed, zooming in to see if your floral arch was symmetrical, but perhaps the most enduring Victorian legacy of all is the belief that weddings are a reflection of moral worth, that a beautiful ceremony proves virtue. It's why even now, couples feel pressure to get it right, to make every detail meaningful. The Victorians feared social ruin. We fear FOMO. They had etiquette manuals, we have Reddit threads, and both can ruin your day equally. Still, amid all the extravagance and exhaustion, there's something almost poetic about it. Beneath the anxiety, the debt, and the drama lies the same fragile hope that drove the Victorians to preserve their dresses and bankrupt their parents. The belief that love deserves ceremony, that two people standing together in front of everyone means something. The Victorians just wrap that meaning in too much satin and social panic. We wrap it in Wi-Fi and emotional burnout. So when the band's late, the cake's leaning, and your cousin Liv streams your tears, take comfort. You're participating in a traditional 180 years old. The Victorians walked so your wedding planner could run. Victorians invented wedding stress. We just added Wi-Fi and hashtags. There are ghosts still linger at every overpriced venue whispering, "It's not about love, dear, it's about logistics."